I am Camille, 34 years old, and until recently my family thought I was just a quiet college dropout, pushing papers at a medical billing desk. I had just returned home from a grueling 7-day business trip just 2 days before Christmas. The crisp winter wind bit at my face, but it was absolutely nothing compared to the icy chill that ran down my spine when I pulled into my driveway. My 9-year-old daughter Aaliyah was standing entirely alone on the freezing front porch. She was not wearing her winter coat. Her tiny shoulders shook with violent sobs she could barely suppress, and her small hands were gripped tightly around the porch railing. When she looked up and saw me walking up the pathway, her eyes were wide with a kind of raw terror that no child should ever have to feel. She shrank back against the brick wall, her voice trembling so hard I could barely hear her over the wind. She whispered that her father told her if she let me inside the house, I would hurt her again. Before I could even process the sheer horror of those words or wrap my arms around my freezing baby, the heavy oak front door swung violently open. But it was not my husband standing there in the entryway. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth and tried to tear you down. Standing in the doorway of my own home was my older sister Kendra. She was leaning casually against the doorframe, swirling a glass of my expensive Cabernet Sauvignon. But what made my blood boil was what she was wearing. She had on my custom emerald green silk robe, the one I had tailored specifically for my anniversary last year. The belt was tied loosely around her waist, and she looked down at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated triumph. Her perfectly manicured toes were tucked into a pair of fluffy slippers, acting as if she had lived in this house her entire life. I stood frozen on the bottom step of the porch, staring at the woman who shared my blood. Kendra had always been the golden child of our family. She was a luxury real estate broker, a former pageant queen, and the absolute pride and joy of our parents. She embodied everything our family valued: high society respectability, flawless appearances, and ruthless ambition. I, on the other hand, was the family embarrassment. The one who supposedly lacked the drive to finish a traditional degree. The one who settled for a quiet, mediocre life in their eyes. But seeing her standing in my doorway, draped in my clothing and drinking my wine, while my daughter shivered in the cold, pushed me past the point of ordinary anger. "What do you think you are doing, Kendra?" I asked, my voice dangerously calm. I stepped forward, reaching out to grab Aaliyah, but Kendra sharply stepped into the path, physically blocking my way to my own child. "I would not take another step if I were you, Camille," Kendra sneered, taking a slow, deliberate sip of the dark red wine. "You do not belong here anymore. In fact, you are legally not allowed to be here." Before I could demand an explanation for her insane statement, a tall figure stepped out of the shadows of the foyer and stood right behind her. It was Julian, my husband of 10 years. He was wearing his signature tailored charcoal suit, the one he always wore when he wanted to project power and absolute authority. As a prominent defense attorney and the head deacon at our parents' incredibly wealthy megachurch, Julian was obsessed with his public image. He placed a possessive hand on Kendra's shoulder, a casual gesture of intimacy that confirmed every terrible suspicion I had buried deep down for months. Julian did not look at me with any warmth, guilt, or regret. His eyes were cold and calculating. He reached into his suit jacket and pulled out a folded piece of thick legal paper. He tossed it through the open doorway. It fluttered in the freezing wind before landing right at my feet on the frost-covered welcome mat. "Pick it up, Camille," Julian commanded, his voice dripping with condescension. "It is a temporary restraining order, signed by Judge Hastings just an hour ago. You are officially ordered to stay 500 feet away from me, from Aaliyah, and from this property." I looked down at the paper, the bold black letters glaring up at me. I slowly bent down and picked it up, my eyes scanning the heavily stamped document. The words jumped off the page like physical blows: fabricated claims of physical abuse, wild allegations of mental instability, statements claiming I was a severe danger to my own child. The sheer audacity of the lies took my breath away. They had painted me as a violent, erratic woman who could not be trusted to be left alone with her own daughter. "You are lying," I said, my voice tight but unwavering as I stared back at him. "You know exactly what kind of mother I am. You know I have never laid a hand on Aaliyah in my entire life." Kendra let out a sharp, mocking laugh that echoed into the quiet suburban street. She stepped slightly forward, looking down her nose at me. "Face it, Camille. You are holding him back. Julian is launching his city council campaign tomorrow morning. He is going to be the next big political star in this city. He needs a wife who actually looks like a first lady. A woman who knows how to network, how to host galas, how to command a room filled with donors. He does not need a college dropout who pushes papers at a medical billing desk all day. You simply do not fit the narrative anymore." "And you do?" I asked, staring directly into my sister's smug face. "You are sleeping with your sister's husband in her own house." "I am upgrading his life," Kendra shot back without a single ounce of shame. "And before you think about running to Mama and Daddy to cry about this, save your breath. Reverend Silas and Deidre already know everything. In fact, they completely agree with us." That revelation hit me harder than the restraining order. My parents, the pillars of the community, the moral compasses of the largest African American megachurch in the state, had signed off on this profound betrayal. They were so obsessed with their legacy, their prestige, and their social standing in elite circles that they were willing to throw their own daughter to the wolves just to secure Julian's political future. They wanted the glamorous real estate broker and the handsome attorney to be the face of their family dynasty, not the quiet daughter they had always viewed as a massive failure. Julian stepped in front of Kendra, his towering frame blocking the warmth of the house from spilling onto the porch. "Your parents are pragmatic people, Camille. They know a winning ticket when they see one. They have already given Kendra and me their absolute blessing. The church community will be told that you suffered a severe mental breakdown and that Kendra heroically stepped in to help me raise Aaliyah. It is the perfect story of faith and family resilience. The voters will eat it up." "This is my house, Julian," I said, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. "This house was left to me by my grandfather. It is my ancestral home. You cannot just lock me out of it." Julian smiled, a cold, predatory stretching of his lips. "Check the county records tomorrow morning, sweetheart. The deed was heavily contested and transferred. And if you take one more step toward this porch, I will call the police, who are already on standby waiting at the end of the block. You will be arrested for violating a court order right in front of your daughter. Do you really want Aaliyah to see you handcuffed and dragged away in the back of a squad car on Christmas week?" I looked past Julian and Kendra straight at my little girl. Aaliyah was sobbing quietly, terrified by the adults arguing, confused by the father she trusted and the aunt she knew. My heart shattered into a million pieces seeing the sheer fear in her eyes. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to rush the door, to tear Kendra out of my robe, to fight Julian tooth and nail right there on the frozen concrete. But I am not the impulsive, emotional wreck they painted me to be in that fake court document. I am a strategist. I build incredibly complex systems for a living. I know that when your enemy holds the high ground, you do not charge blindly. You systematically undermine the ground beneath their feet until they fall. I did not scream. I did not drop to my knees and beg. I slowly walked up the first 2 steps of the porch, stopping exactly where the invisible boundary line of safety remained. I locked eyes with Aaliyah. Her bottom lip was trembling uncontrollably. "Aaliyah, look at me," I said, my voice projecting a deep, soothing warmth despite the freezing wind. She slowly lifted her tear-stained face to meet my gaze. "I love you more than anything in this world. I want you to be brave for Mommy tonight. I promise you I am coming back for you. Nobody is going to take you away from me. Do you hear me? Be brave." Julian scoffed, rolling his eyes in exaggerated annoyance. "Enough of the dramatic goodbye. Get off my property before I make that call." I stood up straight, shifting my gaze from my daughter to the 2 people who genuinely thought they had just ruined my life forever. I looked at Kendra in her stolen luxury and Julian in his unearned arrogance. They thought they had backed a helpless clerk into a corner. They thought they were dealing with someone who had absolutely no resources, no power, and no recourse. They had absolutely no idea who I really was. Keep the robe, Kendra, I said smoothly, turning around. Green never was my color anyway. I walked down the driveway with deliberate, measured steps. The gravel crunched loudly under my boots. I could feel their smug stares burning into my back, victorious and heavily arrogant. I reached my car, unlocked it, and slid into the driver's seat. The heavy thud of the car door shutting completely blocked out the howling wind. I sat in the silent, cold interior of my vehicle. I did not shed a single tear. There was no time for sorrow. There was only time for execution. I pulled my phone from my coat pocket. It was not a cheap prepaid phone, but a secure, highly encrypted device. I opened my contacts and dialed a number that only 3 people in the entire world had access to. The line rang twice before a crisp, highly professional voice answered on the other end. Ms. Vance, what are your orders? I looked through the windshield, watching Julian shut the heavy oak door of my house, locking my daughter inside with his mistress. I let out a slow, steady breath. Execute Protocol Alpha, I said, my voice echoing with finality in the quiet car. Let them take the bait. The tires of my car slipped slightly on the icy asphalt as I tore out of my neighborhood, but I kept my foot pressed firmly on the gas pedal. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. I had executed Protocol Alpha, but the burning need for answers drove me toward the one place I knew the truth was hiding in plain sight. I drove straight toward the affluent gated community of Oak Ridge Estates, the exclusive neighborhood where my parents resided. Reverend Silas and Deidre Vance did not just live in a house. They lived in a sprawling, multi-million-dollar compound funded by the unwavering devotion and tithes of their 20,000-member congregation. The massive wrought iron gates loomed ahead, flanked by stone pillars and security cameras. The guard recognized my car and waved me through, completely unaware that the daughter of his employer had just been rendered homeless by a fraudulent court order. I navigated the winding, snow-covered driveway, parking my modest sedan directly behind my father's pristine luxury SUV. The massive columns of the estate rose into the dark winter sky, radiating wealth, power, and an unyielding obsession with respectability. I did not bother ringing the doorbell. I pushed open the heavy mahogany front doors and marched straight down the echoing marble hallway. The scent of fresh pine, expensive catering, and burning cedar filled the air, a stark contrast to the freezing porch where my daughter was currently trapped. I burst into the formal dining room. The space was enormous, dominated by a custom-built dining table that could comfortably seat 20 people. A crystal chandelier cast a warm golden glow over the room. My mother, Deidre, was seated at the head of the table, entirely engrossed in her work. She was surrounded by perfectly folded linen napkins, velvet ribbon swatches, and towering stacks of gold-embossed seating charts for the annual mega-church Christmas Eve gala. My father, Reverend Silas, stood near the roaring fireplace, swirling a glass of sparkling water while dictating notes to his assistant over a Bluetooth earpiece. Neither of them jumped when the heavy doors hit the wall. In fact, my mother did not even bother to lift her gaze from the seating arrangements. Why is my husband standing in my house with my sister? I demanded, my voice cutting through the quiet elegance of the room. Why did Julian just hand me a temporary restraining order filled with absolute lies? And why did he say that you two gave him your blessing? My father tapped his earpiece, ending his call. He turned to face me, his pastoral mask perfectly in place. He sighed, the exact same heavy, practiced sigh he used when dealing with a difficult congregant. Camille, lower your voice. The catering staff is in the kitchen preparing the tasting menu, and we do not need your theatrics echoing through the house on a Sunday evening. I stepped closer to the table, my boots leaving wet tracks on the expensive Persian rug. My husband just locked me out of the home my grandfather built. He is claiming I am a physical danger to Aaliyah. Do not tell me to lower my voice. Did you know about this? My mother carefully set down her silver fountain pen. She smoothed the front of her tailored cashmere dress and finally looked up at me. Her eyes were devoid of any maternal warmth, reflecting only the cold calculation of a woman protecting her social empire. We know that Julian is officially launching his campaign for city council tomorrow morning. We know that the media will be watching his every move. He needs a stable, respectable household to present to the voters, and we know that you have been acting increasingly erratic. Erratic! I repeated, my voice shaking with a mixture of fury and absolute disbelief. I have been working 16-hour days. I just returned from a grueling 7-day business trip to provide for my family. My mother let out a sharp, condescending laugh that bounced off the high ceilings. Working at that little medical billing desk of yours, please, Camille, stop pretending you are building some kind of empire. You have been jealous of Kendra since you were teenagers. You have resented her ever since she crossed the burning sands in her sorority draped in pearls, while you were stuck taking remedial classes at the local community college. Kendra is polished. She knows how to navigate our world. She knows how to handle the intense pressure of public life. She is sleeping with my husband, I stated clearly, leaning my hands flat on the polished dining table. She is committing adultery with a married man. She was wearing my clothes and drinking my wine. My father stepped forward, his pastoral voice booming with the authority that commanded thousands every Sunday. Julian is a deacon in my church, Camille. He is the head of the financial committee. He brings millions of dollars in donations to our expansion project. He is a pillar of this entire city. We will not let your petty jealousy or your little emotional episodes ruin his political career or tarnish our family legacy. The restraining order is for the best. You need time away to seek professional help. Kendra is simply stepping in to provide maternal stability for Aaliyah until the election season is over. The sheer audacity of his words paralyzed me. They were justifying adultery, fraud, and the kidnapping of my daughter under the guise of Christian respectability and political ambition. They truly believed I was a fragile, uneducated failure who could be easily swept under the rug to keep their marble floors perfectly clean. Before I could unleash the fury building inside me, the dining room doors swung open again. Tasha, Julian's younger sister, strutted into the room. She was wearing a designer winter coat draped over her shoulders, her arms loaded with a thick stack of glossy VIP invitations. Tasha was the ultimate church socialite, a woman who lived entirely for country club gossip and high society drama. She stopped dead in her tracks when she saw me standing there in my damp coat. A wicked, knowing smile immediately spread across her perfectly contoured face. "Oh, Camille, I certainly did not expect to see you here," Tasha purred, walking past me as if I were an invisible piece of old furniture. She dropped the heavy stack of invitations directly onto my mother's meticulously arranged seating charts. "Deidre the printer rushed these overnight just like you asked. Julian and Kendra's new joint campaign account is already fully funded by the church board, so we went ahead and upgraded all the gala gift bags to the premium tier." I froze, the words echoing loudly in my mind. Joint campaign account, fully funded by the church board. Tasha turned to me, feigning deep sympathy, while her eyes danced with malicious joy. "It really is such a shame things did not work out between you and Julian. But you have to admit, he and Kendra just make sense together. They are the new power couple of the district. The wealthy donors absolutely adore her. She just has that elegant first lady energy that Julian needs to secure the elite vote." My mother nodded in total agreement, smiling warmly at Tasha. "Kendra has always known how to carry the family name. She understands the assignment perfectly. And Julian is a man destined for greatness. We simply cannot have any messy distractions right now." I looked at the three of them, my mother, my father, and my sister-in-law. The realization crashed over me like a massive tidal wave, chilling me far deeper than the brutal winter storm raging outside. My family had not just turned a blind eye to Julian's affair. They had not just passively abandoned me to save face. They were actively orchestrating my destruction. They had bankrolled his political campaign using church funds, seamlessly swapping me out for Kendra because they believed she fit their high society narrative better. They had literally purchased a new life for my husband and my sister, and they had likely bought the judge to ensure I could not fight back. They thought I was entirely powerless. They thought my supposed medical billing job gave me zero leverage, zero funds, and zero credibility to challenge them in court or in public. They thought they held all the winning cards because they controlled the church, the community, and the narrative. They had looked at my quiet demeanor and mistaken it for weakness. I stood up straight, smoothing the front of my heavy winter coat. The profound anger that had been simmering in my chest crystallized into pure, unbreakable focus. I did not scream. I did not flip the dining table or tear the seating charts to shreds. I did not threaten them with immediate exposure. I simply looked at my mother with a calm, dead-eyed stare that finally made her confident smile falter. "You always did love a good performance, Mother," I said, my voice eerily quiet and perfectly steady. "Make sure you get a front row seat for the grand finale." My father frowned, his pastoral mask slipping for a fraction of a second. "What is that supposed to mean? Camille, do not make any threats you cannot back up. You have no money for a legal battle, and no one in this city will take your word over mine or Julian's." "I do not need them to take my word," I replied softly. "I just need them to watch." I turned my back on them and walked out of the grand dining room. Tasha let out a loud, mocking sigh of relief behind me, complaining to my mother about how tense I always made the room. I ignored her entirely. I walked down the long marble hallway, my footsteps echoing in the massive hollow house. I stepped out the side door and back into the freezing December night. The howling wind whipped my hair across my face as I walked toward my car. The isolation was absolute and profound. My husband, my sister, my parents, my in-laws. Every single person who was supposed to protect me had conspired to destroy me for the sake of superficial appearances and political power. They had stolen my house, isolated my daughter, and attempted to erase my entire existence. I unlocked my car and slid into the driver's seat, starting the engine to get the heater running. I stared at the grand, brilliantly lit mansion of my parents. They thought they were completely untouchable behind their wrought iron gates and their millions in church funds. They had no idea that I held the patent to a biomedical software system that was about to revolutionize the industry. They had no idea I was sitting on an empire. Suddenly, my encrypted phone vibrated heavily in my coat pocket. The sharp buzz startled me in the quiet, dark car. I pulled the device out. The screen displayed a secure, untraceable message from an unknown number. There was no greeting, no signature, just a single precise instruction glowing in bright white text against the black screen. "Meet me at the underground garage on 5th, come alone." I stared at the glowing message. Very few people had access to this secure number, and absolutely none of them were in my family. Someone else knew what was happening. Someone else was operating in the shadows, watching the exact same pieces move across the board. I put the car in gear, my headlights cutting sharply through the falling snow. Let them have their stolen champagne and their fake campaign accounts tonight. The real game was just beginning right now. The drive to the underground parking garage on 5th Avenue was a blur of falling snow and flashing city lights. The heating vent in my car blasted warm air against my frozen hands, but the chill inside my chest refused to thaw. My mind was racing, piecing together the horrifying reality of my situation. My parents were not just naive bystanders manipulated by my charismatic husband. They were active investors in his carefully crafted illusion. They were funding Julian's political campaign, fully aware that he had thrown me out into the freezing cold and stolen my child. They had chosen their precious social standing over their own daughter. I turned the steering wheel sharply, descending into the cavernous concrete belly of the parking structure. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered unsteadily, casting long, menacing shadows across the empty parking bays. I drove down to the 4th sublevel exactly as the encrypted message instructed. The tires squeaked loudly against the painted concrete floor. I killed the engine and sat in the suffocating silence, the only sound the frantic beating of my own heart. I kept my hand resting near the heavy metal flashlight tucked into my door panel. I had no idea who was waiting for me in the dark, and after tonight I knew I could not trust a single soul. A shadow detached itself from a thick concrete pillar about 50 feet away. My breath caught in my throat as the figure walked slowly into the harsh glare of the overhead lights. I tensed, ready to throw the car into reverse and hit the gas, but the posture of the approaching man made me pause. He walked with a slight slouch, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of a nondescript navy peacoat. It was not Julian with his aggressive chest-out swagger. Nor was it one of the private security guards my father employed at the church. It was Darren. Darren was Kendra's husband. He was the quiet, unassuming IT guy who always sat in the farthest corner of the room during our lavish family Thanksgiving dinners. While Julian and my father commanded the room with booming voices and expensive cigars, Darren was the man nursing a single beer, watching everyone else with silent, unblinking eyes. My family treated him like a piece of the wallpaper. They barely acknowledged his presence, assuming his quiet nature equated to a lack of ambition or intelligence. I rolled down the window just an inch, the cold, damp air rushing into the warm cabin. Darren did not speak. He simply gestured for me to unlock the passenger door. I hesitated for a fraction of a second, then pressed the unlock button. He slid into the passenger seat, bringing the scent of freezing rain and black coffee with him. He shut the door softly, sealing us inside the quiet vehicle. We sat in silence for a long moment. I gripped the steering wheel, waiting for him to declare his allegiance. I asked him flatly if Kendra had sent him to finish the job. I asked if he was there to threaten me or offer some insulting financial payoff to make me disappear quietly into the night. Darren let out a short, dry laugh that lacked any real humor. He reached into his heavy coat pocket and pulled out a thick military-grade encrypted USB drive. It landed on the center console with a heavy metallic clink. Kendra thinks because I do not wear a $5,000 suit or preach from a pulpit, I am stupid. Darren said, his voice remarkably steady and devoid of the usual meekness he displayed around my family. She thinks because I work with computers, I just fix routers and reboot servers. I am a forensic auditor, Camille. I track ghosts for a living. I follow the money that people try to erase. I stared at the silver drive resting between us, my pulse quickening. What is on that drive, Darren? He turned to look at me, and for the first time in the 10 years I had known him, I saw cold, calculated fury burning in his eyes. Proof, he said simply. Proof of exactly who your husband and my wife really are. They have been having an affair for 3 years, Camille. 3 entire years. The words hit me in the chest, but to my surprise I did not shatter. The betrayal was massive, but the sheer shock of the night had already calloused my emotions. I asked him how he found out. I asked if he had followed them, or if he had found some careless romantic text message on her phone. Darren shook his head, a dark amusement coloring his tone. Amateurs get caught by text messages and hotel receipts. Julian and Kendra are far too arrogant to slip up like that. No, I found out because I noticed a discrepancy in Kendra's tax filings. A tiny, almost invisible anomaly in her quarterly statements. I pulled the thread and the entire sweater unraveled. Liars always leave a paper trail, Camille. You just have to know how to read the ink. He tapped a finger against the encrypted USB drive. They are not just sleeping together, they are stealing together. That drive contains everything. Bank routing numbers, wire transfer receipts, digital signatures, and offshore account ledgers. Julian did not just open a joint political campaign account with my wife. He is a thief, and he stole from the one place no one would ever dare to look. I frowned, trying to keep up with the magnitude of what he was implying. I asked him what Julian could possibly steal that would require a forensic audit to uncover. The church, Darren stated, watching my face carefully to gauge my reaction. Julian embezzled $3 million from Reverend Silas's community expansion fund. The air in the car suddenly felt incredibly thin. $3 million. For the past 2 years, my parents had relentlessly pushed the congregation to donate to a massive building project. Widows gave their pension checks, single mothers gave their meager savings, all believing they were funding a state-of-the-art community center and a youth shelter. Julian, as the head deacon and the primary financial overseer of the church, had absolute control over the incoming capital. My parents trusted him implicitly. They handed him the keys to the kingdom because he looked the part of a righteous, successful man. Darren detailed the elaborate scheme. He explained that Julian did not just wire the money into a personal account. He was far too cunning for that. Julian routed the $3 million through a highly complex maze of offshore shell corporations. Once the funds were sufficiently obscured, he brought the money back onto American soil by filtering it directly through Kendra's luxury real estate brokerage. They disguised the stolen church tithes as legitimate high-end real estate commissions and consulting fees. Kendra washed the money completely clean, making it look like brilliant business profits rather than stolen charity funds. What did they do with $3 million of clean money? I asked, my mind already racing through the legal implications. Julian bought a building, Darren replied, leaning back against the leather seat. A massive state-of-the-art commercial property right in the heart of the downtown financial district. He is setting up his own independent law firm, and he is using the top floor as his permanent political headquarters. He wants to separate himself from your father's shadow. Julian wants to become his own independent power player in this city, and he used your parents' congregation to foot the entire bill. The absolute depravity of the situation was staggering. My parents were currently sitting in their dining room, funding Julian's political campaign, completely unaware that he had already robbed them blind. They were protecting a man who was actively draining their legacy to build his own. They thought they were backing a winner, but they had literally handed the keys to their empire to a parasite. Darren let out a low chuckle, a sound filled with dark, vengeful satisfaction. He pointed to the USB drive again. Julian genuinely thinks he is a mastermind, Darren said, a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. He thinks he executed the perfect crime. He bought the commercial building through a heavily shielded blind LLC. He layered the legal ownership so deeply that no public record, no reporter, and no casual investigator could ever tie his name or the stolen church money to that property. He believes he is completely insulated from any fallout. Darren paused, turning to look me directly in the eyes, the quiet, ignored eye. T-Guy was holding the executioner's axe, and he was handing it right to me. But Julian made one critical error, Darren continued softly. In his desperate rush to hide the stolen funds and secure his new headquarters before the election launch, he failed to thoroughly investigate the overarching holding company that owns the actual land beneath his new building. He could not crack the final layer of corporate shielding to find out who the parent company is. He has no idea who his actual landlord is. I stared at the silver drive resting on the console. The freezing chill that had gripped my body all evening was suddenly replaced by a blazing, triumphant inferno. The universe had just handed me the perfect weapon. Julian had just locked me out of my grandfather's house, confident that I was a powerless woman with no assets. My parents had discarded me, convinced I was a failure who pushed papers for a living. They thought my medical billing company was a tiny, irrelevant clerical service. They had absolutely no idea that I held the patent for a revolutionary dialysis software system, or that my corporation was currently valued at over $150 million. More importantly, Julian had no idea that my corporation held an extensive portfolio of commercial real estate throughout the city, operating under various subsidiary holding companies to maintain my absolute privacy. I slowly picked up the heavy USB drive, feeling its cold metal against my palm. I looked at Darren, the man who had suffered the exact same quiet indignities and betrayals that I had endured. A slow, terrifying smile spread across my face. It was not a smile of joy. It was the smile of a predator who had just locked the doors to the cage. "I know exactly who the landlord of that building is, Darren," I whispered, my voice dripping with lethal certainty. "It is me." Darren stared at me. The silence in the freezing car stretched out until it almost snapped. A slow, incredulous smile crept across his face. He reached into his heavy navy coat, pulled out a secondary physical ledger, and tossed it onto my lap. He told me to take everything. He told me to burn their entire world to the ground. I promised him I would leave nothing but ashes. The morning sun glared blindingly off the floor-to-ceiling glass walls of Ms. Sterling's downtown office. Evelyn Sterling was not just a family law attorney. She was a corporate executioner. She wore tailored, pristine white suits and commanded an hourly rate that made tech billionaires flinch. She was the woman you called when you wanted to legally obliterate someone, and I sat across from her vast marble desk, watching her manicured fingers trace the lines of the encrypted financial documents Darren had provided. Ms. Sterling tapped a gold pen against the printed deed to the commercial property Julian had just acquired. The sheer blinding arrogance of my husband's scheme was laid out in black and white. Julian had set up a dummy corporation to sign a 10-year ironclad lease for a luxury downtown high-rise. To secure the prestigious space and fund the immediate lavish renovations for his new independent law firm and political headquarters, he had wired $3 million directly into the property management's holding account. That holding account belonged to Apex Properties, LLC. Apex Properties was a blind subsidiary holding company, and that subsidiary was wholly and exclusively owned by my corporation. Julian had embezzled $3 million from my parents' megachurch and wired it directly into my bank account. He did not do any due diligence on the parent company, Ms. Sterling stated, her voice laced with dangerous, razor-sharp amusement. He was so desperate to hide the church's money from federal regulators and your parents that he used a dark web broker to set up his own shell companies. He blinded himself. He dumped stolen funds right into your lap, Camille. I leaned back in the plush leather chair, my mind calculating the sheer velocity of his incoming destruction. He assumed the landlord was some faceless commercial conglomerate. He just wanted the prime real estate to launch his city council campaign. Ms. Sterling opened a separate, much thicker leather portfolio and slid it across the cold marble desk. Your husband is not just a thief, Camille. He is highly proactive. His legal team served these to my office an hour ago. I picked up the heavy stack of legal documents. It was an emergency motion for divorce coupled with a demand for immediate and total spousal support. Julian was petitioning the family court to seize my business assets. He claimed that my erratic behavior and the fabricated physical abuse charges on the temporary restraining order proved I was an unfit mother and an unstable business owner. He was demanding 100% ownership of my company in exchange for dropping the restraining order and allowing me supervised, restricted visitation with my own daughter. I read the outrageous demands and actually let out a genuine breathy laugh. It echoed sharply against the pristine glass walls. My family truly believed I ran a failing medical billing desk out of a cheap leased office park. My mother thought I spent my miserable days answering angry phone calls from insurance agents begging for pennies. Julian thought my business was a pathetic little clerical operation, barely turning enough profit to cover its own overhead. They were so blinded by their own narcissism, so consumed by their high society obsession, that they never once bothered to look at the actual corporate filings. My company, Renal Tech Solutions, had stopped doing basic medical billing 6 years ago. Instead, I had spent those quiet, ignored years writing complex code, securing massive venture capital, and quietly developing a revolutionary biomedical software system. The program fully automated and optimized dialysis treatments for major hospital networks nationwide. We held an exclusive ironclad patent. The FDA had officially approved our system rollout 2 months ago. I was currently fielding aggressive buyout offers from 3 major pharmaceutical conglomerates, all bidding well over $150 million. Julian was trying to legally steal a rusty bicycle, completely unaware he was demanding the keys to a fleet of private jets. He states here in Section 4 that he is entitled to your medical billing company because he provided the initial $3,000 loan to buy your first computers 10 years ago. Ms. Sterling noted, her perfectly arched eyebrow rising in pure disbelief. He is attempting a hostile takeover of a multi-million-dollar biomedical empire because he genuinely thinks it is a glorified typing pool. Before I could respond, a sharp, demanding chime echoed from Ms. Sterling's desktop computer. She clicked open her secure inbox, her sharp eyes scanning the screen. Her expression immediately hardened into a mask of pure predatory focus. "It is an email from opposing counsel," she announced, turning the large monitor so I could see the text. Julian had hired Marcus Vance, a high-priced, notoriously arrogant divorce attorney who specialized in financially destroying women in family court. The email was a brazen, thinly veiled extortion attempt. Marcus Vance explicitly laid out the terms of my surrender. If I fought the temporary restraining order, they would drag my name through the local press. They would use my parents' immense influence and religious platform to paint me as an emotionally unstable, highly dangerous woman. Julian would ensure I never saw my daughter Aaliyah again. However, if I quietly and immediately signed over complete ownership of my business to Julian, he would graciously drop the abuse charges. He would grant me weekend visitation rights. The email ended with a condescending, sickening note suggesting I accept the generous deal, so Julian could use the business revenue to fund his city council campaign while Kendra gracefully stepped into the role of Aaliyah's primary caregiver. They wanted to steal my daughter, fund a political campaign with my money, and permanently replace me with my sister. Ms. Sterling folded her hands together, resting her chin on her knuckles. The air in the executive office grew incredibly still. She looked at me, her eyes gleaming with the thrill of the impending slaughter. She had all the ammunition she needed to obliterate the man. "They handed us the gasoline and the matches, Camille," Ms. Sterling said, her voice dropping to a lethal whisper. "Do we crush him now? I can file the injunctions immediately. We can expose the embezzled church funds to the press, freeze his campaign accounts, and have him arrested for grand fraud before dinner time." I stared at the arrogant email glowing brightly on the screen. Julian wanted everything. He wanted to own my business so badly that he was willing to commit extortion and perjury to get it. My mind raced through the legal implications connecting Darren's forensic audit with Julian's greedy demands. If I destroyed him right now, he would just be a thief who got caught trying to steal church funds. My parents would undoubtedly hire the best criminal defense attorneys in the state to protect their own reputation. They would spin the narrative claiming Julian merely made a massive accounting error. They would protect him to protect the church's expansion project and their flawless public image. I needed something far more permanent. I needed a trap so flawless, so deeply entrenched in his own greed that not even my father's millions could buy his way out. I looked at the deed to the commercial building. I looked at the offshore routing numbers detailing the $3 million in stolen church donations. And then I looked at the aggressive legal demand for my business. Apex Properties LLC was a legally binding subsidiary of my corporation. Julian had wired $3 million of stolen money into Apex Properties. Right now, I was legally responsible for that company. But if Julian demanded total ownership of my business in the divorce settlement, he would also take ownership of every single subsidiary attached to it. If I surrendered the company to him, he would legally become the sole owner of Apex Properties. He would instantly become the man who owned the account that received the stolen church funds. He would legally document himself as the mastermind who laundered $3 million into his own pocket. He would literally sign his own federal indictment. I stood up and walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out over the sprawling city below. The winter storm had passed, leaving a bright, blinding glare off the snow-covered skyscrapers. Julian thought he was playing a simple game of chess against a naive, uneducated novice. He had no idea I was about to flip the entire board and burn the pieces. I turned back to Ms. Sterling and shook my head. No. Ms. Sterling frowned, slightly genuine confusion breaking her composed exterior. "Camille, we have him dead to rights. We have the paper trail. Why wait? Because if we hit him now, he is just a man accused of stealing by a bitter wife." I explained softly, tracing my finger over his lawyer's signature on the printed document. "I want him to be a man who legally and permanently confesses to it on federal documents." I leaned over the cold marble desk, meeting my attorney's eyes with absolute resolve. "Draft the surrender documents. Give him exactly what he is asking for. Give him 100% ownership of the subsidiary company Apex Properties. Tell his lawyer I am terrified of losing Aaliyah and I am desperate to make a deal to keep my visitation rights." Ms. Sterling stared at me for a long, silent moment. Her brilliant legal mind rapidly processed the maneuver. She connected the stolen church funds to the holding account and then to Julian's aggressive demand for total ownership. I watched the beautiful realization dawn on her face. She saw the absolute, inescapable brilliance of the snare. Let him legally claim ownership of the subsidiary company. I commanded, my voice cold and hard as steel. Let him sign his name on it. Let him take the stolen money, the fake lease, and the massive federal liability and wrap it right around his own neck. Ms. Sterling leaned back in her plush leather chair. A slow, wicked grin spread across her face, perfectly mirroring the predatory smile I had given Darren the night before. "Oh, Camille," she whispered, her fingers flying across her keyboard to begin drafting the surrender documents. "He is going to walk right into a federal prison cell, and he is going to thank you for holding the door." The crisp December wind whipped against my face as I left Ms. Sterling's downtown office building, but the cold barely registered. The legal guillotine was perfectly positioned, and Julian was eagerly greasing the gears himself. But legal maneuvering was only half the battle. I still had to secure my daughter. 48 hours later, the sprawling campus of the Oak Hills Preparatory Academy was illuminated by hundreds of twinkling fairy lights. The annual winter recital was the crown jewel of the local elite community's social calendar. It was a place where wealthy parents gathered in designer winter coats to watch their children perform while secretly networking and judging one another's tax brackets. Tonight it was also the unofficial launch party for Julian's city council campaign. I parked my unassuming rental car at the far edge of the visitor lot, stepping into the freezing shadows. I pulled out my phone and opened a highly precise GPS mapping application. The temporary restraining order mandated that I remain exactly 500 feet away from Julian and Kendra at all times. Violating that order, even by a single foot, would give Julian the legal ammunition to have me arrested in front of my daughter and permanently strip me of my parental rights. I mapped the exact dimensions of the school auditorium, calculated the distance from the VIP front row seats to the upper balcony, and smiled. I had exactly 512 feet of clearance. I slipped through the side entrance of the auditorium, bypassing the brightly lit foyer, where local press photographers and campaign aides were milling about. I climbed the back staircase and took a seat in the absolute darkest corner of the upper balcony. From my vantage point, I had a perfect, unobstructed view of the stage and the front rows below. The double doors of the auditorium swung open, and the flashbulbs immediately began to fire. Julian strode down the center aisle, looking every inch the charismatic, devoted public servant. He wore a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, flashing his brilliant, practiced smile as he shook hands with the wealthy donors and influential PTA board members. He paused perfectly for the local news cameras, projecting the image of a brave, resilient father weathering a tragic family crisis. Kendra walked faithfully at his side, holding my 9-year-old daughter's hand. My breath hitched in my chest at the sight of Aaliyah. She was wearing a beautiful emerald green velvet dress, her hair styled in perfect braids. But her small face was pale, and her eyes constantly darted around the massive room, searching desperately for me. My hands gripped the wooden armrests of my seat so tightly that my knuckles ached. Every maternal instinct screamed at me to run down the stairs, push through the crowd of hypocrites, and tear my child away from the woman pretending to be her mother. But I forced myself to remain perfectly still. I had to endure this performance to guarantee their destruction. Kendra was playing her role to absolute perfection. She knelt in the center aisle, making a highly exaggerated show of smoothing out the skirt of Aaliyah's dress and adjusting her collar. She gathered a group of the most influential PTA mothers around her, ensuring she was the center of their sympathetic attention. Even from the balcony, her piercing stage-whispered voice carried clearly over the ambient noise of the auditorium. "It is just so hard stepping up when a biological mother completely abandons her duties." Kendra sighed, pressing a hand over her heart in a gesture of profound martyrdom. "Julian has been so incredibly brave through all of this. Camille just snapped. It was a complete mental break, and we had to step in to protect this sweet little girl. But Julian and I are entirely dedicated to giving Aaliyah the stability and love she so desperately needs right now." The PTA mothers nodded in unison, murmuring their collective sympathy and praising Kendra for her selfless devotion. They looked at Julian with admiration and looked at Kendra like a saint. They were entirely captivated by the tragic narrative of a successful man and his supportive sister-in-law stepping up to save a child from a deranged, unfit mother. I watched the sickening display with eyes like chips of ice. Kendra thought she was cementing her place in high society. She had no idea she was dancing on the edge of a cliff. Down below the auditorium, lights began to dim, signaling the 10-minute warning before the recital commenced. I watched intently as Aaliyah tugged on Julian's sleeve, pointing toward the side corridor. Julian, completely engrossed in a conversation with a prominent real estate developer, waved her off dismissively and pointed toward the restrooms. Kendra was too busy accepting compliments on her designer coat to notice. Aaliyah slipped away from their side, walking quickly down the dimly lit side hallway toward the girls' bathroom. This was my only window. I moved silently down the back staircase, my rubber-soled boots making zero sound on the concrete. I completely bypassed the main lobby and used the maintenance corridor, a path I knew intimately from years of volunteering at school events. I intercepted my daughter in a quiet, empty alcove just outside the restrooms, entirely shielded from the main hall and the press cameras. Aaliyah froze when she saw me stepping out of the shadows. Her big brown eyes welled with tears, and her lower lip trembled. "Mommy!" she sobbed, abandoning all decorum and sprinting directly into my arms. I dropped to my knees on the cold tile floor, catching her in a fierce, desperate embrace. I buried my face in her hair, breathing in the scent of her strawberry shampoo. The physical pain of being separated from her for 3 days vanished, replaced by an overwhelming surge of protective fury. I held her tightly, rocking her back and forth in the quiet alcove. "Why did you leave?" Aaliyah cried, her small hands gripping the fabric of my coat, as if terrified I would vanish into thin air. "Aunt Kendra said you got sick in your head and you did not want to live at home anymore. Daddy said I am not allowed to call you." The absolute malice of their lies burned through my veins like battery acid, but I forced my voice to remain incredibly calm and soothing. I pulled back slightly, framing her tear-stained face with my hands and wiping her cheeks with my thumbs. "Listen to me very carefully, my brave girl," I whispered, looking directly into her eyes to ensure she felt the absolute certainty of my words. "Mommy did not leave you. I would never ever leave you. Aunt Kendra and Daddy are telling stories right now because they are confused, but I am perfectly fine and I love you more than anything in this entire world." Aaliyah sniffled, nodding slowly as she absorbed my words. The fear in her eyes began to recede, replaced by the deep, unspoken trust she had always placed in me. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out a small velvet jewelry box. I opened it to reveal a custom-made silver necklace. Suspended from the delicate chain was a beautiful miniature glass snow globe. Inside the tiny glass sphere, a highly detailed silver tree stood amidst a flurry of artificial snow. It was a stunning piece of jewelry, completely innocent and appropriate for a child attending a winter recital. I unclasped the silver chain and carefully secured it around Aaliyah's neck, making sure the glass globe rested flat against the velvet of her dress. "I had this made just for you," I said softly, tapping the glass globe with my index finger. "It is magic, Aaliyah. As long as you wear this, Mommy is right there with you. I can hear you and I'm watching over you. You are completely safe." Aaliyah looked down at the beautiful necklace, a small, genuine smile finally breaking through her tears. She touched the glass globe reverently. "Can I wear it to sleep?" "You must wear it to sleep," I instructed, my tone shifting to one of serious importance. "Keep this on, baby. Do not take it off for anyone. Not for Aunt Kendra, not for Daddy, not even for a bath. You keep it on tonight and you hold it tight. Mommy is coming for you tomorrow, I promise." I kissed her forehead, my lips lingering against her warm skin. I heard the distant sound of the auditorium warning bell echoing down the corridor. Our time was up. I stood up, gave her one last reassuring squeeze, and watched her run back toward the bright lights of the main hall. She clutched the snow globe necklace tightly in her small fist, her posture noticeably braver than it had been 10 minutes ago. I retreated back into the maintenance corridor, slipping out the side door into the freezing night, long before Julian or Kendra even realized she had been gone. Hours later, the winter storm slammed against the large glass windows of my sterile, expensive hotel room. The space was completely devoid of personal touches, a temporary command center for the war I was waging. I sat cross-legged on the edge of the pristine white bed, a glowing laptop resting on my knees, and a pair of noise-canceling headphones secured tightly over my ears. The snow globe necklace resting against my daughter's chest was a masterpiece of repurposed technology. As the CEO of a biomedical engineering firm, my company specialized in non-invasive, highly sensitive monitoring equipment. The tiny silver tree inside the glass globe concealed a military-grade, ultra-sensitive audio transmitter originally designed to monitor internal respiratory functions without the need for invasive surgical probes. It was practically undetectable, incredibly powerful, and currently broadcasting a crystal-clear encrypted audio feed directly to my laptop. Through the headphones, I heard the heavy oak front door of my house swinging shut. I heard the distinct muffled sounds of Aaliyah's footsteps heading upstairs to her bedroom, followed by the soft click of her door closing. She was safe. She was asleep. Downstairs, the atmosphere shifted entirely. The audio feed picked up the sharp clinking of ice cubes dropping into heavy crystal glasses. Julian and Kendra were in my living room standing near the marble fireplace. They had dropped the grieving father and the saintly aunt personas the second the front door locked. "Pour me another one, Julian. I am absolutely exhausted from smiling at those insufferable PTA women." Kendra's voice crackled through the headphones, her tone laced with arrogant exhaustion. "If I have to pretend to care about the third-grade bake sale one more time, I am going to lose my mind." Julian let out a deep, booming laugh that made my stomach churn. I heard the distinct sound of expensive bourbon splashing into a glass. "You played your part perfectly, Kendra. The donors were eating out of the palm of your hand. That little speech you gave about stepping up to save my daughter secured us at least $50,000 in campaign pledges tonight alone." "I am a natural." Kendra purred, the sound of her heels clicking against the hardwood floor as she moved closer to him. "But we need to make sure Camille stays completely out of the picture. If she contests the restraining order tomorrow morning, she could make things incredibly messy." I leaned closer to the laptop screen, my finger hovering over the digital recording interface. The progress bar blinked steadily, capturing every single syllable in high-definition audio. Julian scoffed, a sound filled with supreme, untouchable arrogance. "Camille is not going to do a damn thing. She does not have the money to fight my lawyers, and she certainly does not have the influence to fight my judge." "Are you sure?" Kendra asked, a slight note of genuine concern entering her voice. She looked absolutely dead inside when she showed up at the house. She did not even scream. Julian laughed again, the sound reverberating through the hidden microphone with sickening clarity. "She is a coward, Kendra. She has always been a coward. But just to be absolutely certain, I took care of the legal hurdles this afternoon." I held my breath. The silence in my hotel room was absolute save for the howling wind outside. "What do you mean you took care of it?" Kendra asked. "I mean, I secured the permanent order," Julian stated, his voice dropping into a conspiratorial, boastful register. "I met with Judge Harrison privately in his chambers. The man loves his expensive habits just as much as he loves his gavel. He took the $50,000 bribe perfectly. The cash was in a gym bag, and he did not even blink. He signed the paperwork right there on his desk. The temporary restraining order becomes a permanent, irrevocable mandate tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. Julian took a long, slow sip of his bourbon, his satisfaction bleeding through the audio feed. "It is entirely sealed, Kendra," Julian bragged, sealing his own coffin with every word. "Camille is finished. She is completely locked out of her own life. I am getting full custody. I am taking her little billing business for alimony. And we have the church's $3 million perfectly hidden in the new building. We won." I reached out and hit the digital stop button on the recording software. The audio files saved instantly, securely uploaded to 3 separate encrypted cloud servers. I slowly pulled the headphones off my ears and let them rest around my neck. I looked at the glowing audio file on the screen. Julian thought he was an untouchable mastermind. He thought he had outsmarted his wife, outmaneuvered his church, and bought the justice system. He genuinely believed he had won the war before I even fired a single shot. I closed the laptop, a cold, serene smile spreading across my face in the quiet, darkened hotel room. Julian had just handed me a recorded confession to bribery, extortion, and judicial corruption. He had just handed me the rope, and tomorrow morning in family court, I was going to help him tie the knot. The morning sun broke through the hotel blinds, casting sharp angles across my laptop screen. I had not slept a single minute, but I felt more energized than I had in a decade. The audio file of Julian's drunken confession to judicial bribery and embezzlement was securely locked away in multiple encrypted vaults. He had handed me the ultimate leverage. But before I dropped the federal hammer on my soon-to-be ex-husband, I had a specific piece of family business to attend to. It was Friday afternoon, and Friday meant it was time for my mother and sister to perform for the cameras. The Oakwood Country Club sat at the highest elevation in the city, an exclusive fortress of manicured golf courses, valet parking, and staggering membership fees. Today, its grand ballroom was hosting the annual Women of Excellence charity luncheon. On paper, it was a philanthropic gathering to raise money for local youth programs. In reality, it was a highly orchestrated networking event serving as the unofficial launchpad for Julian's mayoral run. The room would be packed with the wives of district judges, real estate tycoons, and political donors. It was exactly the kind of audience my mother and sister craved. I drove my rental car past the line of idling luxury vehicles at the valet stand and parked in a spot strictly reserved for platinum corporate members. I stepped out into the crisp winter air. I was not wearing the damp, desperate clothes from 2 nights ago. I wore a tailored charcoal trench coat over a sleek, dark pantsuit. My posture was flawless. I walked through the towering glass double doors of the country club with the absolute terrifying confidence of a woman who owned the ground beneath her feet. The grand ballroom was a sea of pastel dresses, oversized floral centerpieces, and the sharp clinking of crystal champagne flutes. A string quartet played softly in the corner. I stood at the entrance, letting my eyes sweep the room until I found the head table. Deidre and Kendra were seated at the absolute center of the room, holding court like royalty. They were surrounded by the most influential women in the city. My mother was wearing a striking pearl necklace, laughing politely with the wife of the police commissioner. Kendra sat beside her, radiating the elegant suffering martyrdom she had perfected at Aaliyah's recital the night before. They were sipping mimosas, completely secure in their stolen status, entirely unaware that the executioner had just walked into the room. I bypassed the reception desk and walked straight down the center aisle of the ballroom. Conversations began to halt as I passed. The wealthy patrons turned their heads, their perfectly manicured eyebrows furrowing in confusion. I was a glaring disruption in their pastel paradise. My mother spotted me when I was about 20 feet away from the head table. The polite, practiced smile instantly vanished from her face. Her hand froze halfway to her mouth, the champagne flute trembling slightly against her lips. Kendra followed her gaze, and her eyes widened in genuine shock. They had both assumed I was broken, hiding in a cheap motel, paralyzed by the fraudulent restraining order Julian had purchased. I stopped directly in front of the head table. The silence radiating outward from our confrontation quickly infected the surrounding tables. Dozens of the most powerful women in the city stopped eating, their eyes locked eagerly on the unfolding drama. Deidre stood up so fast her chair scraped loudly against the polished hardwood floor. Her face flushed an angry mottled red. She leaned over the table, her voice vibrating with mortification and raw fury. "Security!" Deidre snapped, her voice cutting sharply through the quiet room. "Who let her in here? This is an elite table, Camille, not a soup kitchen. You have absolutely no right to show your face at this event." Kendra let out a sharp, mocking laugh, leaning back in her chair and scanning me up and down with utter contempt. She turned to the police commissioner's wife with a stage whisper designed to be heard by everyone within a 50-foot radius. "Look at her shoes. She probably took the bus here. It is just so sad how completely unhinged she has become since Julian took custody of Aaliyah." I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice or try to defend myself against their public humiliation. I simply let them dig their social graves deeper into the dirt. Arthur, the general manager of the Oakwood Country Club, came sprinting across the ballroom. He was a distinguished older man who practically lived to serve the elite membership. His face was pale and he was breathing heavily as he reached our table. Deidre crossed her arms over her chest, shooting me a look of absolute triumph. "Arthur, thank goodness," my mother commanded, pointing a perfectly manicured finger directly at my chest. "Have this woman removed from the premises immediately. She is trespassing and she is disturbing my guests." Arthur did not grab my arm. He did not signal for the security guards lingering near the entrance. Instead, he stopped abruptly, his eyes darting frantically between my mother's furious face and my calm, unwavering stare. Arthur swallowed hard, smoothing the lapels of his suit before executing a deep deferential bow directly to me. "Ms. Vance." Arthur stammered, his voice laced with absolute terror. "I sincerely apologize for any disruption. We were not informed you would be utilizing your corporate membership today. Had we known, we would have prepared the private executive dining room for you immediately." The entire ballroom seemed to lose oxygen. My mother's arm slowly dropped to her side. The triumphant sneer melted off her face, replaced by a look of profound, uncomprehending shock. Kendra sat bolt upright, her eyes darting between Arthur and me, as if the manager had suddenly started speaking a foreign language. The women seated at the table exchanged wild, bewildered glances. "Corporate membership," Deidre repeated, her voice cracking slightly. "Arthur, what are you talking about? She does not have a membership here. She is a medical billing clerk." Arthur looked at my mother with a mixture of pity and sheer panic. He clearly had no idea how to navigate the massive social landmine he had just stepped on. He turned back to me silently, pleading for instruction. I reached into the inner pocket of my trench coat and pulled out a heavy, matte black Centurion card. The solid metal clinked loudly as I dropped it directly onto the pristine white tablecloth in front of my mother's plate. "Arthur," I said, my voice projecting clearly across the silent room, "I will be covering the $15,000 catering bill for my mother's little tea party today. Put it on my corporate account. And please ensure the waitstaff receives an additional 40% gratuity for having to deal with this particular table." Arthur nodded frantically, picking up the heavy black card as if it were a holy relic. "Right away, Miss Vance. Thank you for your incredible generosity." He bowed again and practically sprinted away toward the billing office. I turned my attention back to the head table. The silence was absolute. My mother was staring at the space where the black card had been, her mouth slightly open, her entire worldview short-circuiting. The women around her, women she had spent decades trying to impress with her fake church wealth, were now looking at me with awe and looking at Deidre with intense suspicion. They were sharks and they smelled blood in the water. Kendra looked physically ill. The arrogant smirk was completely gone. She gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles white, desperately trying to process how the sister she had relentlessly bullied and discarded was suddenly buying out a $15,000 luncheon without blinking. I placed my hands flat on the table and leaned forward, closing the distance between Kendra and myself. The scent of her expensive stolen perfume made my stomach turn, but I kept my face perfectly serene. I lowered my voice, ensuring only she and my mother could hear the lethal precision of my words. "Enjoy the caviar, sis," I whispered, the icy chill of my tone making Kendra physically shrink back into her chair. "By the way, Darren was very thorough when he tracked the $3 million you and Julian stole from the church expansion fund. He found every single offshore routing number you washed through your brokerage firm." Kendra's eyes widened in sheer unadulterated terror. The blood drained completely from her face, leaving her looking like a ghost. She tried to speak, to formulate a denial, but her throat seized up. "The state real estate board audits usually happen on Fridays," I continued smoothly, stepping back and straightening my coat. "Check your email." Right on cue, the heavy silence of the ballroom was pierced by the sharp, persistent buzzing of Kendra's phone resting on the table next to her mimosa. Kendra stared at the vibrating device as if it were a live grenade. Her hand shook violently as she reached out and flipped the screen over. I did not need to see the display to know what it said. I had personally submitted Darren's forensic audit file to the State Regulatory Board at 6 o'clock this morning. I knew exactly what that email contained. It was an emergency notification of license suspension pending an immediate federal investigation into massive financial fraud and money laundering. Kendra let out a choked, breathless gasp. The phone slipped from her fingers and clattered onto the china plate. She looked up at me, her eyes wide with the realization that her career, her freedom, and her stolen life were entirely over. My mother looked frantically between Kendra's terrified face and the buzzing phone, finally realizing that the daughter she had championed was about to bring the federal government crashing down on their church. The polished elite facade she had spent 30 years building was disintegrating in real time right in front of the very women she wanted to rule. I did not wait for them to find their voices. I had delivered the message. I turned on my heel and walked out of the grand ballroom, my footsteps steady and measured. I left them sitting in the wreckage of their own greed, surrounded by the whispers of high society, while the deafening buzz of Kendra's phone signaled the absolute end of their empire. The heavy oak doors of the Family Court Mediation Center felt like the entrance to a vault. It was Monday morning, exactly 48 hours since I had left my mother and sister suffocating in the ashes of their own social destruction. The air inside the courthouse was sterile and cold, smelling of floor wax and stale coffee. I sat perfectly still in the high-backed leather chair, staring at the polished mahogany table stretching out in front of me. Ms. Sterling sat to my right, her posture impeccably rigid, her expression carved from absolute ice. We were waiting for the execution to begin. The door handle clicked sharply. Julian strode into the windowless room, sucking all the oxygen out of the space with his sheer, unadulterated arrogance. He was wearing a custom-tailored $5,000 Italian wool suit. The deep navy pinstripes and the silk pocket square were designed to project the image of a wealthy, untouchable power player. He looked less like a man attending a bitter divorce mediation and more like a politician stepping up to a victory podium. Trailing right behind him was Marcus Vance, his high-priced shark of an attorney. Vance dropped a massive leather briefcase onto the table with a loud, aggressive thud intended to be a physical display of dominance. Julian did not even bother to look at me as he took his seat. He unbuttoned his suit jacket with a practiced fluid motion and leaned back, crossing one leg over his knee. He was the picture of supreme unbothered confidence. He genuinely believed that the permanent restraining order he had purchased from a corrupt judge on Friday afternoon had completely broken my spirit. The court-appointed mediator. A tired-looking woman with graying hair and thick glasses cleared her throat and began reading the standard introductory boilerplate. She reminded us that this session was a legally binding negotiation designed to avoid a protracted public trial. Julian waved his hand in the air, cutting her off, before she could even finish her second sentence. "We can skip the formalities," Julian declared, his booming voice echoing off the bare walls. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table and finally locking his eyes onto mine. His gaze was devoid of any warmth or history. It was the look of a predator staring at trapped prey. "We all know exactly why we are here today. I am a reasonable man, Camille. I have no desire to drag the mother of my child through a humiliating public trial, despite your recent highly erratic behavior." Ms. Sterling did not flinch. She simply turned her icy gaze toward Marcus Vance. "Your definition of reasonable is fascinating, considering your client orchestrated a fraudulent restraining order to sever a mother from her 9-year-old daughter." Vance smiled, revealing perfectly capped teeth. "The judge found the evidence of your client's instability highly compelling, Ms. Sterling. The order is permanent. Julian currently holds sole legal and physical custody of Aaliyah. He holds the house. He holds the bank accounts. We are not here to negotiate from a position of equal footing. We are here to offer a generous path toward resolution." Vance reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents, sliding them across the smooth mahogany surface. They stopped precisely in the center of the table. "This is a total asset transfer agreement," Vance explained, his voice dripping with condescension. "Julian is willing to completely drop the physical abuse allegations. He is willing to petition the judge to dissolve the restraining order. He will even graciously allow your client joint unsupervised custody of Aaliyah. In exchange, Camille will sign over 100% ownership of her corporate entity, including all subholdings, directly to Julian." I stared at the paperwork. They were holding my daughter hostage for a ransom they thought was a handful of pocket change. Julian leaned across the table, unable to resist the urge to twist the knife himself. He wanted to watch me bleed. "You are lucky I am taking this worthless company off your hands," Julian sneered, his voice laced with absolute disgust. "It is a dying medical billing desk. You are drowning in overhead, and you have no idea how to manage corporate growth. You have never had the brains to run a real business anyway. You only got it off the ground because I wrote you that initial $3,000 check 10 years ago. You should go back to community college, Camille. Take a few basic accounting classes. Let a real man handle the corporate assets." Every insult, every patronizing syllable he spat at me was a testament to his own fatal ignorance. He had never once bothered to look at my tax returns. He had never once asked to see my corporate portfolio. He assumed because I worked quietly from a home office, because I did not wear expensive suits or brag at country club dinners, that my work was insignificant. I looked down at the table, letting my shoulders slump forward. I forced my breathing to become shallow and ragged. I thought about the sheer terror in Aaliyah's eyes at the winter recital, the way she had clung to my coat, and the tears came naturally. One single, perfectly timed tear spilled over my lower lash line and tracked slowly down my cheek. I let my hands tremble as I reached out and pulled the thick stack of transfer documents toward me. "Camille, do not do this," Ms. Sterling warned sharply, playing her designated role with Oscar-worthy perfection. She placed her hand firmly over the paperwork, pulling it back slightly. "This is textbook extortion. He is leveraging your child to steal your livelihood. We can fight this in front of an appellate judge. We can expose the bribery." I shook my head frantically, my voice cracking as I looked up at Julian with wide, defeated eyes. "I cannot wait for an appellate court. He has Aaliyah. He will not let me speak to her. I just want my daughter back. I just want to see my baby." Julian's smug grin widened until it consumed his entire face. He leaned back in his chair, practically vibrating with the thrill of total victory. He had broken me. He had won. "Listen to your lawyer, Camille." Julian mocked, his tone sickeningly sweet. "You can fight me and lose everything, including Aaliyah. Or you can sign the paper, walk away from a failing business, and get your weekend visitations. The choice is yours." I let out a broken, shuddering breath. I picked up the heavy black fountain pen resting on the table. My hand shook violently as I lowered the nib to the paper. The document was explicitly clear. By signing, I was transferring complete, irrevocable ownership of my overarching corporate entity, and specifically naming the primary subsidiary Apex Properties LLC directly to Julian Vance. I signed my name on the first dotted line. The scratch of the pen sounded deafening in the quiet room. I turned the page and signed the second line, then the third. I initialed every single rider, every single transfer clause, legally binding myself to the surrender. The moment the final signature was complete, Julian practically lunged across the table. He snatched the thick stack of papers right out from under my trembling fingers. He did not even bother to read the pages I had just signed. He simply flipped to the final execution page, grabbed his own gold-plated pen, and slashed his signature across the bottom with aggressive, triumphant strokes. He slid the document toward the court-appointed mediator. She reviewed the signatures, stamped the pages with the official county seal, and quietly separated the carbon copies. The transfer was officially executed. It was legally binding. Julian was now the sole owner of Apex Properties LLC. Julian stood up, buttoning his $5,000 suit jacket with a sharp, crisp motion. He picked up his copy of the transfer deed, rolling it into a tight cylinder and tapping it against his palm. He looked down at me, a pathetic, weeping woman, sitting in the shadow of his greatness. "I will have my assistant email you a visitation schedule by the end of the week," Julian said, his voice completely devoid of any remaining warmth. "Try to get your life together, Camille. Aaliyah needs stability, not whatever this is." He turned on his heel and walked toward the heavy oak doors, Marcus Vance trailing right behind him like a loyal shadow. The heavy door clicked shut, the sound echoing with an intense, hollow finality. The mediator quietly gathered her remaining files, offered a brief, uncomfortable murmur of sympathy, and slipped out of the room to file the official transfer with the county clerk. The second the door closed behind her, the atmosphere in the room shifted violently. The weeping defeated, Mother vanished like a ghost in the sun. I sat up perfectly straight, my spine snapping into rigid alignment. I reached up and wiped the single tear from my cheek, my hand completely steady. The trembling was gone. The fear was gone. Ms. Sterling calmly opened her sleek briefcase and began organizing her files. She did not look up as she spoke, her voice ringing with cold, clinical satisfaction. He did not read the fine print, Ms. Sterling noted dryly, snapping the clasps of her briefcase shut. I leaned back in my leather chair, a slow, terrifying smile spreading across my face. I looked at the blank mahogany table where Julian had just eagerly signed his own death warrant. "No, he did not," I replied, the ice in my voice matching the absolute freeze in my veins. He was so blinded by the thought of taking my money that he did not bother to run a liability check on the specific subsidiary he demanded. He just eagerly assumed 100% legal ownership and total financial liability for Apex Properties. Ms. Sterling looked up at me, her eyes gleaming with the predatory thrill of the trap snapping shut. Apex Properties is the exact shell company he blindly wired the $3 million of stolen church funds into last week. I continued, my smile widening into a lethal grin. But he does not know that Apex Properties also owes the IRS exactly $5 million in intentionally defaulted back taxes, and he certainly does not know that Apex Properties has been under an active high-level federal investigation for corporate fraud for the past 6 months. I stood up, smoothing the front of my charcoal trench coat. The cage was not just locked, it was sealed, welded shut, and sinking into the ocean. "The trap is set, Evelyn," I whispered, turning toward the door. "Julian just legally claimed ownership of stolen church millions, a $5 million federal tax debt, and an active criminal indictment. Now we let the feds do the rest." The afternoon of Christmas Eve descended on the city with a bitter, biting cold. The sky was the color of bruised iron, perfectly matching the mood of the day. Tonight was the annual church gala, the lavish, highly publicized event where my parents and Julian planned to officially crown him the golden boy of local politics. Kendra had been preparing for this night for weeks, treating it like her own personal coronation. Right now, she was sitting in a plush leather chair at a luxury salon downtown, a foil cape draped over her shoulders and a glass of complimentary champagne in her hand. She was getting a $500 blowout, blissfully unaware that her husband was currently executing the surgical removal of her entire life. Darren moved through their suburban home with the quiet, devastating efficiency of a ghost. He did not pack Kendra's things. He did not leave a sentimental note. He simply packed 3 large suitcases with his children's clothes, their favorite toys, and their passports. While Kendra was busy gossiping with her stylist about her upcoming debut as the mayor's right-hand woman, Darren logged into their joint banking portal. He executed 3 massive, untraceable wire transfers, completely emptying all their joint accounts. The funds vanished into a secure, heavily encrypted offshore trust that Kendra's amateur real estate lawyers would never be able to locate. He loaded his kids into his unassuming sedan, told them they were going on a surprise holiday adventure, and drove straight to the international airport. He was leaving the blast radius, and he was taking the only things that mattered. While Darren was securing his children, Julian was busy neglecting his. He was drunk on his own perceived power, riding the high of the morning's mediation session. He genuinely believed he had backed me into a corner and stripped me of my company. His ego demanded an audience. He scheduled a last-minute pre-gala press interview with a local political reporter to discuss his visionary plans for the city's future. But Julian had a problem. He had to maintain the image of the devoted single father, which meant he needed someone to watch Aaliyah while he gave his televised performance. Instead of acting like an actual parent, he hired a 16-year-old neighborhood babysitter, slapped a $100 bill in her hand, and walked out the door. As I sat in the passenger seat of Ms. Sterling's black town car, my phone vibrated sharply against my leg. The screen lit up with a text message from Julian. "Don't even think about coming near the house tonight. The cops are on speed dial." I stared at the glowing text, feeling the familiar burn of his condescension. He was so predictable. He always telegraphed his arrogance right before he tripped over it. I did not reply. I simply locked my phone and looked out the tinted window. We were pulling up to the back entrance of the state courthouse. Ms. Sterling did not walk into the courthouse. She marched like a commanding general leading an invasion. She bypassed the standard family court clerks and headed directly for the chambers of the chief administrative judge, a man possessing a fierce reputation for absolute unbending integrity. He was the exact opposite of the corrupt official Julian had bought the night before. We were granted an immediate emergency ex parte hearing. The heavy mahogany doors closed, sealing us inside the quiet, imposing room. Ms. Sterling did not waste a single second with pleasantries. She placed her laptop on the judge's desk, connected a small external speaker, and pressed play. Julian's arrogant, bourbon-soaked voice filled the chamber. He bragged about the $50,000 bribe. He named the corrupt judge. He detailed the exact nature of the extortion, laughing about locking me out of my own life. I watched the chief judge's face transform. The initial polite neutrality hardened into a mask of pure, unadulterated judicial fury. The color drained from his face as he listened to a member of his own court being compromised. When the recording finished, the silence in the room was heavier than lead. The chief judge did not ask for a lengthy explanation. He pulled the fraudulent permanent restraining order file across his desk, uncapped his pen, and struck a violent red line straight through it. "This order is vacated immediately," the judge declared, his voice shaking with suppressed rage. He reached for a fresh stack of federal warrants. "Your client retains full, unhindered legal and physical custody of her daughter. As for Mr. Vance, I am issuing an immediate no-bail bench warrant for his arrest on charges of judicial bribery, extortion, and fraud. The FBI field office will be notified within the hour regarding the financial confessions on this tape." Ms. Sterling collected the freshly stamped, perfectly legitimate court orders. We had the sword, and now it was time to swing it. The drive to my house felt agonizingly slow, though Ms. Sterling's private driver expertly navigated the icy suburban streets. The sun had completely set, casting long, dark shadows across the manicured lawns. The neighborhood was quiet, the residents already preparing for their elegant Christmas Eve dinners. I stepped out of the town car before it even came to a complete stop. I marched up the familiar brick walkway of the home Julian had locked me out of, the heavily stamped court order clutched tightly in my right hand. I did not bother to knock. I bypassed the smart lock with my master administrative code, a backdoor Julian had been too technologically illiterate to remove, and pushed the heavy front door open. The house was quiet. The television was playing softly in the living room. The teenage babysitter jumped up from the sofa, her eyes wide with panic as I strode into the foyer. She recognized me immediately from the framed photos Julian had not yet bothered to take down. "Mrs. Vance," the teenager stammered, clutching her phone. "Mr. Vance said you were not allowed to be here. He said I have to call the police if you show up." I walked right up to her, my expression calm, but leaving absolutely no room for debate. I held up the official court document pointing directly to the chief judge's signature and the bright red seal. "Julian Vance is no longer the legal guardian of my daughter, and he is currently a wanted fugitive." I stated, my voice echoing off the hardwood floors. "You have exactly 10 seconds to grab your coat, take the money he gave you, and walk out that front door before I have you named as an accessory to kidnapping. Go." The girl did not argue. She took one look at my face, grabbed her winter jacket from the coat rack, and sprinted out the door into the freezing night. I turned and ran up the stairs, my heart hammering against my ribs. I threw open the door to Aaliyah's bedroom. She was sitting on the edge of her bed, fully dressed in her winter clothes, clutching a small backpack. Around her neck, the silver snow globe necklace caught the ambient light from the hallway. She had heard my voice downstairs. She had been waiting. "Mommy!" she gasped, launching herself across the room. I caught her mid-air, wrapping my arms around her so tightly I thought my chest might crack. I buried my face in her shoulder, letting out a sharp, shaky breath. The nightmare of the last few days was officially over. I had my daughter back. "I told you I was coming," I whispered, kissing the top of her head. We are leaving right now. Do you have everything you need? Aaliyah nodded furiously, holding onto my neck. Daddy said he was coming back to change his clothes for the big party. He was really angry today, Mommy. Daddy has a lot more to be angry about, I replied smoothly, setting her down and grabbing her hand. We moved quickly. I did not bother to pack any of my own remaining belongings. Those things were just fabric and glass. They held no value anymore. I had the only thing that mattered. Before we left the house, I walked into the master bedroom. I pulled a single crisp sheet of paper from my coat pocket. It was not a court order. It was a formal, legally executed corporate document from Apex Properties, LLC. I walked over to the perfectly made king-size bed and placed the paper directly in the center of Julian's expensive silk pillows. I smoothed the edges down, ensuring it was the very first thing he would see when he walked into the room. I took Aaliyah's hand, walked out the front door, and locked it securely behind me. The black town car was idling at the curb, waiting to take us to a secure location where my parents and Julian could never reach us. 45 minutes later, Julian Vance pulled his luxury sedan into the driveway. He was running late, furious that his press interview had run over schedule. He needed to shower, put on his custom-tailored tuxedo, and get to the church gala, where he was scheduled to give the keynote address. He expected to find a quiet house, a compliant babysitter, and his daughter tucked away out of sight. He unlocked the front door and stepped into the foyer. The house was completely dark. The silence was absolute. There was no television playing, no sound of footsteps. He called out for the babysitter. Silence. He called out for Aaliyah. Nothing. A flicker of genuine panic finally pierced his arrogant armor. He rushed up the stairs, taking them two at a time, and threw open the door to Aaliyah's room. It was empty. The bed was unmade, her backpack was gone, and the closet door hung open. He backed out into the hallway, his breathing growing shallow. He turned and sprinted into the master bedroom, reaching for the light switch. The overhead lights flooded the room, illuminating the pristine space. His tuxedo was hanging perfectly on the valet stand. His expensive cologne sat on the dresser, and sitting perfectly centered on his bed was a single piece of paper. Julian walked slowly toward the bed, his hands beginning to tremble. He picked up the document. It bore the official letterhead of Apex Properties, LLC, the very company he had smugly forced me to surrender to him just hours ago. The company holding $3 million in stolen church funds. It was an eviction notice for his law firm, effective immediately. The locks had already been changed. His servers had been seized by the property management. The prestigious downtown headquarters he had paid for with embezzled money was gone. Julian stared at the paper, the reality of the trap finally closing its steel jaws around him. He had demanded the company to destroy me, and in doing so, he had just evicted himself from his own empire. He crushed the eviction notice in his fist, his knuckles turning white as a primal sound of rage tore from his throat. But the clock on his bedside table flashed 7 p.m. He did not have time to scream. He did not have time to call his lawyer or track me down. The mega-church Christmas Eve gala was starting, and the entire political establishment of the city was waiting for his keynote address. He shoved the crumpled paper into his pocket, forced his trembling arms into his tuxedo jacket, and drove toward the Cathedral of Grace, with a hollow, sinking terror gnawing at his stomach. The Cathedral of Grace banquet hall was an architectural monument to unchecked greed masquerading as faith. Tonight, the massive vaulted room was dripping in excessive wealth. Towering crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over 80 circular tables draped in white silk. Massive centerpieces of imported winter roses and silver ribbons dominated the room. A 12-piece orchestra played soft, classical renditions of holiday hymns in the corner. The city's absolute elite were all in attendance. The mayor, the district attorneys, the real estate tycoons, and the heavy-hitting political donors mingled, sipping sparkling cider from crystal flutes. It was the absolute pinnacle of respectability, the exact platform my family had spent 30 years ruthlessly clawing their way toward. Julian pulled his luxury sedan up to the valet stand, stepping out onto the plush red carpet, rolling all the way up to the cathedral doors. Kendra was already waiting for him under the awning, shivering slightly in her silver sequined gown. Her hair was perfectly sculpted, her makeup flawless, but her face was pinched with furious irritation. "Where is Darren?" Kendra hissed the second Julian was within earshot, maintaining a rigid plastic smile for the local newspaper photographers, snapping pictures from the sidewalk. "He was supposed to bring the kids an hour ago. He is completely ignoring my texts." Julian adjusted his bow tie, his hands still slightly shaking from the realization of his financial ruin. "I do not care about Darren," Julian snapped through gritted teeth, waving politely at a passing city councilman. "Just smile for the cameras, Kendra. We have to secure the mayor's endorsement tonight." Kendra smoothed the front of her gown, expertly burying her irritation as the camera flashes exploded around them. They hooked arms and walked through the towering glass doors together, the perfect image of a devout, powerful power couple. They had no idea they were walking straight into a slaughterhouse. Inside the banquet hall, my mother Deidre was in her absolute element. She was wearing a custom emerald green dress, a diamond brooch resting at her collarbone. She held a glass of sparkling water, holding court with the mayor's wife and the chief of police near the front of the stage. This was the moment she had engineered. She was about to be the mother-in-law of the city's next mayor, the untouchable matriarch of a religious empire. "My son-in-law is a beacon of Christian morality," Deidre bragged, her voice carrying loudly over the gentle hum of the orchestra. She gestured grandly toward Julian and Kendra as they descended the grand staircase into the hall. "And my daughter Kendra is his rock. They truly exemplify the traditional faithful values this city so desperately needs right now." The mayor's wife nodded in polite agreement, completely unaware of the stolen expansion funds paying for the extravagant catering she was currently enjoying. At the front of the room, Reverend Silas stepped up to the acrylic pulpit. He was practically glowing under the targeted stage lights. His booming, charismatic voice echoed through the state-of-the-art sound system, demanding the attention of the room. The orchestra swelled to a dramatic finish and then faded into silence. The gala was officially in full swing. I was standing on the other side of the massive carved oak doors at the back of the banquet hall. I could hear my father's voice preaching about the virtues of honesty and charity. The sheer hypocrisy of his words tasted like ash, but I did not feel angry anymore. I felt perfectly, terrifyingly calm. I was not wearing my usual muted work clothes. I was not hiding behind sensible gray blazers or practical flat shoes. I wore a breathtaking floor-length crimson gown. The silk hugged my frame, trailing behind me in a bold, unapologetic sweep of color. It was the color of a warning. It was a visual declaration of war against a room full of people who demanded absolute conformity. Darren stood flanking my left side. He had safely secured his children on a private flight to his sister's house in Toronto 3 hours ago. The trust fund containing all of Kendra's stolen money was locked behind impenetrable international banking walls. He had returned to the city specifically to stand beside me for the final strike. Flanking my right side were 2 federal agents in plain clothes. They were impeccably dressed in dark suits, their expressions unreadable, the subtle bulges of their holsters visible beneath their jackets. They had spent the last 2 hours reviewing the hard drives Darren had handed over and the audio recordings I had provided. They were not here to attend a party. They were here to execute an indictment. I placed both hands flat against the heavy oak doors. I pushed them open with a resounding, thunderous crash. The heavy wood slammed violently against the cathedral walls. The sound echoed like a gunshot through the cavernous banquet hall. Every single head in the room snapped around. The remaining soft background music abruptly stopped, the cellist freezing with her bow suspended in midair. I stepped onto the plush carpet, the crimson silk of my gown practically glowing under the ambient lights. I was a blazing, undeniable disruption in their sanitized pastel paradise. I did not rush. I walked slowly down the center aisle, my heels clicking sharply against the polished marble floor strips, Darren and the federal agents matching my measured, predatory pace. The wealthy patrons parted like the Red Sea. Conversations died in their throats. The mayor lowered his glass, his brow furrowing in confusion. The wealthy donors and political operatives stared in absolute shock at the woman wearing bright red in the middle of a holy gala, flanked by a man they recognized as Kendra's husband, and 2 men radiating undeniable law enforcement authority. My mother saw me first. The boastful, arrogant smile she had been flashing at the mayor's wife slid right off her face. The crystal glass in her hand tilted, spilling sparkling water onto the toe of her expensive shoe. She grabbed the edge of the nearest table, her knuckles instantly turning white. Kendra was standing near the buffet line. When she saw Darren walking beside me, completely ignoring her, her jaw dropped open. She stepped forward, her voice a shrill, panicked whisper. "Darren, what are you doing? Where are the kids?" Darren did not even look at her. He kept his eyes locked straight ahead, his face a mask of absolute indifference. Kendra shrank back, genuine fear finally penetrating her thick layer of narcissism. Julian stood frozen near the front row of tables. He recognized the two men walking on my right. His background as a defense attorney allowed him to identify federal agents instantly. The blood drained entirely from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, pallid gray. The $5,000 tuxedo suddenly looked like a straitjacket. He knew the eviction notice was just the beginning. The trap was fully sprung. At the pulpit, Reverend Silas gripped the acrylic edges of his podium. His face flushed a dark, furious purple. He had spent decades carefully controlling every aspect of this church, every narrative, every piece of his family's public image. Seeing his discarded scapegoat daughter marching down his center aisle like a conquering queen caused his legendary temper to boil over. Silas grabbed the microphone, his knuckles white, his voice booming over the speakers with undeniable righteous fury. "Camille, how dare you disrupt the Lord's house? Security, remove this woman." Two large security guards in dark blazers started moving down the side aisles, preparing to intercept me. I did not flinch. I did not stop walking. I did not break eye contact with my father. I stopped exactly 20 feet away from the pulpit, standing dead center in the middle of the room. The two federal agents subtly shifted their jackets, resting their hands near their waists. The security guards saw the badges clipped to their belts and instantly froze in their tracks, slowly backing away into the shadows. The entire banquet hall held its collective breath. 500 of the most powerful people in the city were watching the Vance family empire fracture in real time. I looked up at Silas, his face twisting with rage and sudden creeping terror. I did not need a microphone to make my voice heard. I simply raised my right hand and snapped my fingers, signaling the technician locked inside the AV booth at the back of the hall. The technician I had paid $10,000 in cash precisely 1 hour ago. The massive projection screens behind the pulpit flickered to life. A blinding white light washed over the congregation as the twin monitors powered on. The sudden glare illuminated the terrified faces of the city's elite. A low, collective murmur of confusion rippled through the sea of 500 wealthy guests. Women in designer gowns leaned in to whisper to their husbands. The mayor exchanged a bewildered glance with the chief of police. The carefully curated atmosphere of absolute respectability was fracturing by the second. Julian finally snapped out of his paralyzed state. The survival instinct of a cornered animal kicked in. He realized that whatever was about to be projected on those massive screens would permanently destroy his political aspirations and his legal career. His face contorted with desperation. He lunged forward, abandoning all pretense of high society decorum, intending to rush the stage, rip the cables from the podium, and physically silence me. He barely made it 3 steps. Darren stepped seamlessly into the center aisle, planting his feet squarely in Julian's path. Darren was a former college linebacker, solid and completely unmovable. Julian slammed into him, expecting Darren to yield to his authority, but Darren did not budge a single inch. Julian stumbled backward, his $5,000 tuxedo jacket pulling awkwardly across his shoulders. "Move out of my way, Darren," Julian hissed, his voice vibrating with panic and fury. "This is a private church matter. You have absolutely no right to be here." Darren stared down at the man who had actively helped steal his family's financial security. Darren's expression was devoid of any anger. It was completely empty, which made it infinitely more terrifying. Without saying a word, Darren reached inside the inner pocket of his suit jacket. He pulled out a thick, sealed manila envelope and shoved it forcefully into the center of Julian's chest. Julian reflexively grabbed the package to keep it from hitting the floor. "I am not here for the church," Darren stated, his voice carrying a quiet, lethal weight that carried to the first few rows of tables. "I am here to deliver a message to your wife. Consider those legally served. They are divorce papers. I have full physical custody of the children, and the offshore accounts are entirely empty. Have a wonderful gala, Julian. Kendra let out a sharp, breathless shriek from the buffet line. Her knees buckled slightly, catching the edge of a catering table to keep from collapsing onto the floor. The golden couple of the congregation was disintegrating right in front of the very people they had tried to impress. I did not wait for Julian to recover from Darren's physical blockade. I walked gracefully up the carpeted steps of the pulpit. My crimson gown swept across the polished wood, trailing behind me like liquid fire. My father stood frozen behind the thick acrylic podium. Reverend Silas, a man who had commanded this room with an iron fist for 30 years, was visibly shaking. Sweat beaded on his forehead, catching the glare of the stage lights. He looked down at the federal agents, standing at the base of the stairs, their hands resting casually near their holstered weapons, and he realized he was completely powerless. I stepped right up to the podium, invading his personal space. I did not ask for permission. I reached out and pried the microphone directly from his trembling fingers. He let go without a fight, shrinking back from the sheer icy authority radiating from my posture. I turned to face the congregation. The silence in the massive banquet hall was absolute. You could have heard a pin drop on the marble floors. 500 pairs of eyes were locked onto me. My family loves a good sermon about morality. I began, my voice echoing through the state-of-the-art sound system, crisp and unwavering. We gather in this room every year to celebrate virtue, to applaud charity, and to pat ourselves on the back for being the absolute pillars of this community. So tonight, let us preach about truth. I let my gaze sweep slowly across the front row, locking eyes with my mother. Deidre was trembling violently, her emerald green dress suddenly looking garish and cheap. For years, I was the designated embarrassment of this family. I continued my words, striking the air with surgical precision. I was the dropout. I was the one who was not elite enough for this church's front row. I did not marry a high-powered politician. I did not parade my wealth for the cameras. My mother just spent the last hour bragging to the mayor about how her son-in-law is a beacon of Christian morality and how her daughter is his perfect rock. They painted me as unstable, as a woman who could not handle the pressure of real success. I paused, letting the weight of my words settle heavily over the room. I raised the small black remote control I had retrieved from the AV technician. But true success is not built on a foundation of lies, I declared, and true power does not require a stolen crown. I pressed the button on the remote. The twin projection screens behind me flashed brightly. A massive high-resolution image of a legal document appeared for the entire congregation to see. It was the deed of trust for a sprawling multi-million-dollar commercial building located in the heart of the city's financial district. A murmur of confusion rippled through the crowd. I saw the mayor lean forward, adjusting his glasses to read the heavily magnified text. Julian stood paralyzed in the center aisle, the manila envelope still clutched in his hands, staring up at the screen with an expression of pure, unfiltered horror. "Let us examine the brilliant legal mind of Julian Vance," I announced, my voice dripping with lethal sarcasm. "Julian, you recently acquired a magnificent new office building for your law firm. You bought it using a blind LLC, a complex corporate shell company designed specifically to hide your vast assets from our impending divorce. You thought you were outsmarting the system. You thought you could lock me out of the marital estate while securing a private fortress for your political headquarters." Julian took a step backward, his chest heaving. He opened his mouth to speak, to object, to scream, but his throat had completely seized. The federal agents at the bottom of the stairs took a subtle step forward, silently warning him to stay exactly where he was. It was a masterful piece of corporate deception. I continued, pacing slowly across the stage. But you forgot one crucial thing, Julian. You never bothered to investigate the ownership structure of the property management firm that sold you the lease. You were so blinded by your own arrogance, so eager to hide your wealth, that you failed to realize who actually owned the parent company of that blind LLC. I pressed the remote again. The screen transitioned to a corporate organizational chart. At the very top, in bold, unmistakable letters, was the name of my primary holding company, I own the parent company. I stated the absolute certainty of my victory ringing off the vaulted ceilings. I have owned it for 5 years. You did not hide your assets from me, Julian. You handed them directly to me. You just paid me $3 million in cash to rent my own building. I am your landlord. The entire banquet hall erupted into shocked gasps. Wealthy investors whispered frantically to one another. The sheer scale of the financial humiliation was staggering. Julian had built his entire reputation on being the smartest man in the room, the untouchable legal shark who could outmaneuver anyone. Instead, he had walked blindly into an elementary corporate trap set by the woman he had relentlessly mocked for dropping out of college. And as your landlord, I added, lowering my voice to a sharp, dangerous pitch that commanded instant silence, I must inform you that you are currently in violation of your lease agreement due to fraudulent financial activity. By the way, Julian, you are officially evicted. The locks were changed an hour ago. Your servers have been seized. Your law firm no longer exists. Julian's knees buckled. He stumbled, catching himself against the back of a silk-draped chair. The carefully constructed facade of the untouchable politician completely shattered. His face drained of all color, leaving him looking like a desperate, broken man. His lungs heaved as he struggled to process the total annihilation of his career, his wealth, and his public standing. He looked up at the massive screens displaying the corporate deed, and then he looked up at me standing at the pulpit. The absolute reality of his destruction finally registered in his mind. "That is my money," Julian screamed, his voice cracking, echoing wildly through the silent cathedral. It was a raw, guttural sound of pure panic. He threw his arm out, pointing a shaking finger at the projection screens. "You stole everything from me. That is my money." I stood perfectly still, letting his desperate scream fade into the cavernous space. I looked down at him, feeling absolutely nothing but clinical satisfaction. I shook my head slowly, my expression completely serene. "No, Julian," I replied, my voice slicing through the heavy air with devastating clarity. "Let us show the congregation whose money it really is." The Cathedral of Grace Banquet Hall was an architectural monument to unchecked greed masquerading as faith. Tonight, the massive vaulted room was dripping in an obscene display of excessive wealth. Towering crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over 80 circular tables draped in imported white silk. Massive centerpieces of winter roses woven with silver ribbons and real gold accents dominated the room. A 12-piece orchestra played soft classical renditions of holiday hymns in the corner, providing an elegant soundtrack to the networking and backroom deals happening on the floor. The city's absolute elite were all in attendance. The mayor, the district attorneys, the real estate tycoons, and the heavy-hitting political donors mingled, sipping sparkling cider from crystal flutes. It was the absolute pinnacle of respectability, the exact platform my family had spent 30 years ruthlessly clawing their way toward. Julian pulled his luxury sedan up to the valet stand, stepping out onto the plush red carpet that rolled all the way up to the towering cathedral doors. Kendra was already waiting for him under the heated awning, shivering slightly in her silver sequined gown. Her hair was perfectly sculpted, her makeup flawless, but beneath the heavy foundation, her face was pinched with furious irritation. She had been standing outside for 10 minutes, maintaining a rigid plastic smile for the local newspaper photographers, snapping pictures from the sidewalk while internally seething. "Where is Darren?" Kendra hissed the second Julian was within earshot, not letting her smile drop for a fraction of a second. "He was supposed to bring the kids an hour ago for the family photo op. He is completely ignoring my texts. My phone is going straight to voicemail. If he embarrasses me tonight, I swear I will make his life a living hell." Julian adjusted his bow tie, his hands still slightly shaking from the realization of his financial ruin. He could not bring himself to care about his sister-in-law's domestic squabbles. "I do not care about Darren," Julian snapped through gritted teeth, waving politely at a passing city councilman. "Just smile for the cameras, Kendra. We have to secure the mayor's endorsement tonight. Everything depends on this evening going perfectly." Kendra smoothed the front of her gown expertly, burying her irritation as the camera flashes exploded around them. They hooked arms and walked through the towering glass doors together, projecting the perfect image of a devout, powerful power couple. They moved through the foyer, shaking hands and kissing cheeks, completely unaware that they were walking straight into a slaughterhouse. Inside the banquet hall, my mother Deidre was in her absolute element. She was wearing a custom emerald green dress, a heavy diamond brooch resting at her collarbone. She held a glass of sparkling water holding court with the mayor's wife, the chief of police, and several prominent local business owners near the front of the stage. This was the moment she had engineered her entire life for. She was about to be the mother-in-law of the city's next mayor, the untouchable matriarch of a religious and political empire. "My son-in-law is a beacon of Christian morality," Deidre bragged, her voice carrying loudly over the gentle hum of the orchestra. She gestured grandly toward Julian and Kendra as they descended the grand staircase into the hall, looking like royalty. "And my daughter Kendra is his rock." They truly exemplify the traditional faithful values this city so desperately needs right now. It takes a strong, unified family to lead this community forward, and Julian has always put his family and his faith above all else. The mayor's wife nodded in polite agreement, completely unaware of the stolen expansion funds paying for the extravagant catering she was currently enjoying, or the bribes funding the political campaign she was supporting. At the front of the room, Reverend Silas stepped up to the acrylic pulpit. He was practically glowing under the targeted stage lights. His booming, charismatic voice echoed through the state-of-the-art sound system, demanding the immediate attention of the room. The orchestra swelled to a dramatic finish and then faded into respectful silence. The gala was officially in full swing. Silas beamed down at his wealthy congregation, his chest puffed out with pride. He was the king of his castle, entirely convinced of his own invincibility. I was standing on the other side of the massive carved oak doors at the back of the banquet hall. I could hear my father's voice preaching about the virtues of honesty, charity, and familial devotion. The sheer hypocrisy of his words tasted like ash in the back of my throat, but I did not feel angry anymore. I did not feel the familiar, crushing weight of inadequacy that had plagued me for 30 years. I felt perfectly terrifyingly calm. I was not wearing my usual muted work clothes. I was not hiding behind sensible gray blazers or practical flat shoes trying to blend into the background. I wore a breathtaking floor-length crimson gown. The silk hugged my frame, trailing behind me in a bold, unapologetic sweep of color. It was the color of a warning. It was the color of a reckoning. It was a visual declaration of war against a room full of people who demanded absolute subservient conformity. Darren stood flanking my left side. He had safely secured his children on a private flight to his sister's house in Toronto 3 hours ago. The offshore trust fund, containing all of Kendra's stolen money, was locked behind impenetrable international banking walls. He had returned to the city, walking away from the blast radius specifically to stand beside me for the final strike. His posture was rigid, his jaw set. He was a man who had finally broken his chains. Flanking my right side were 2 federal agents in plain clothes. They were impeccably dressed in dark suits, their expressions unreadable, the subtle bulges of their holsters visible beneath their jackets. They had spent the last 2 hours reviewing the hard drives Darren had handed over and the audio recordings I had provided. They had listened to Julian confessing to extortion and bribery. They had traced the routed funds Kendra had stolen. They were not here to attend a party. They were here to execute an indictment. I placed both hands flat against the heavy oak doors. I took one final deep breath, letting the cool air fill my lungs. Then I pushed them open with a resounding, thunderous crash. The heavy wood slammed violently against the cathedral walls. The sound echoed like a gunshot through the cavernous banquet hall. Every single head in the room snapped around. The remaining soft background music abruptly stopped, the cellist freezing with her bow suspended in mid-air. I stepped onto the plush carpet, the crimson silk of my gown practically glowing under the ambient lights. I was a blazing, undeniable disruption in their sanitized pastel paradise. I did not rush. I walked slowly down the center aisle, my heels clicking sharply against the polished marble floor strips, Darren and the federal agents matching my measured, predatory pace. The wealthy patrons parted like the Red Sea. Conversations died in their throats. The mayor lowered his glass, his brow furrowing in confusion. The wealthy donors and political operatives stared in absolute shock at the woman wearing bright red in the middle of a holy gala, flanked by a man they recognized as Kendra's husband, and two men radiating undeniable law enforcement authority. My mother saw me first. The boastful, arrogant smile she had been flashing at the mayor's wife slid right off her face. The crystal glass in her hand tilted, spilling sparkling water onto the toe of her expensive shoe. She grabbed the edge of the nearest table, her knuckles instantly turning white. Kendra was standing near the buffet line. When she saw Darren walking beside me, completely ignoring her, her jaw dropped open. She stepped forward, her voice a shrill, panicked whisper. "Darren, what are you doing? Where are the kids?" Darren did not even look at her. He kept his eyes locked straight ahead, his face a mask of absolute indifference. Kendra shrank back, genuine fear finally penetrating her thick layer of narcissism. Julian stood frozen near the front row of tables. He recognized the two men walking on my right. His background as a defense attorney allowed him to identify federal agents instantly. The blood drained entirely from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, pallid gray. The $5,000 tuxedo suddenly looked like a straitjacket. He knew the eviction notice was just the beginning. The trap was fully sprung. At the pulpit, Reverend Silas gripped the acrylic edges of his podium. His face flushed a dark, furious purple. He had spent decades carefully controlling every aspect of this church, every narrative, every piece of his family's public image. Seeing his discarded scapegoat daughter marching down his center aisle like a conquering queen caused his legendary temper to boil over. Silas grabbed the microphone, his knuckles white, his voice booming over the speakers with undeniable righteous fury. "Camille, how dare you disrupt the Lord's house? Security, remove this woman." Two large security guards in dark blazers started moving down the side aisles, preparing to intercept me. I did not flinch. I did not stop walking. I did not break eye contact with my father. I stopped exactly 20 feet away from the pulpit, standing dead center in the middle of the room. The two federal agents subtly shifted their jackets, resting their hands near their waists. The security guards saw the badges clipped to their belts and instantly froze in their tracks, slowly backing away into the shadows. The entire banquet hall held its collective breath. 500 of the most powerful people in the city were watching the Vance family empire fracture in real time. I looked up at Silas, his face twisting with rage and sudden creeping terror. I did not need a microphone to make my voice heard. I simply raised my right hand and snapped my fingers, signaling the technician locked inside the AV booth at the back of the hall. The technician I had paid $10,000 in cash precisely 1 hour ago. The massive projection screens behind the pulpit flickered to life. I stepped away from the pulpit, my crimson silk gown trailing behind me like a river of blood on the polished marble. I descended the altar steps with slow, deliberate precision. I walked directly down the center aisle toward Julian. The local newspaper photographers, sensing the complete destruction of the city's political golden boy, pushed past the frantic event coordinators. The harsh, blinding flashes of their cameras illuminated the sweat pouring down Julian's ashen face. He was trapped in the center of the aisle, a cornered rat wearing a $5,000 tuxedo. The entire elite society of the city leaned forward. Wealthy investors, district attorneys, and real estate tycoons held their collective breath, watching him dig his own grave in real time. I stopped when I was standing mere inches from his trembling frame. The sheer panic radiating from his body was palpable. "You really should read the contracts you force people to sign, Julian," I stated, projecting my crisp, unwavering voice over the silent crowd. "You walked into that mediation room this morning vibrating with absolute arrogance. You thought you were so much smarter than everyone else. You thought you were stealing my life's work to fund your mayoral campaign. You thought I just ran a pathetic little billing desk for a small-time medical supply distributor. You thought you could intimidate me into handing over my livelihood just to keep you quiet. I clicked the presentation remote in my hand. The spreadsheet detailing his embezzled church funds vanished from the massive projection screens. In its place, a breathtaking high-definition image of a recent Forbes magazine spread materialized. There was my face looking sharp-focused and undeniably powerful, positioned right next to a bold headline detailing a massive industry disruption. Beside the article was a certified United States Patent Registry document bearing the federal seal. "Allow me to introduce my actual corporation," I announced, turning slightly, so the mayor and his wife had a perfect, unobstructed view of the screen. "I am the sole founder, CEO, and primary patent holder of Genesis Biomedical. We develop advanced AI-driven diagnostic software for oncology departments around the globe. The company you, Kendra, and my mother spent years relentlessly mocking is currently valued at $150 million. The collective gasp from the room was deafening. It was the sound of 500 powerful people instantly recalculating the social hierarchy of the entire city. I heard Deidre let out a strangled, breathless sound from the front row. Her face contorted in absolute horror. Her entire social existence was based on proximity to wealth, and she had just realized she spent the last decade treating a $150 million tech founder like a designated embarrassing failure. Reverend Silas remained frozen behind the pulpit, his mouth opening and closing silently. He had praised Julian's financial acumen from the pulpit for years, completely blind to the fact that his own discarded daughter owned an empire that dwarfed his church. Julian stared up at the massive Forbes article. His brain desperately tried to process the staggering numbers flashing on the screen. For a split second, I saw his natural parasitic greed overpower his absolute panic. He puffed out his chest, a sickening, desperate smirk crawling back onto his face as he clung to his delusion of control. "Then I own half of it," Julian declared, his voice cracking with manic, hysterical triumph. He threw his arms out wide, playing to the shocked crowd. "I forced you to sign over your corporate assets today. You signed the binding mediation agreement in front of the judge. That $150 million is mine. You just handed me a fortune on a silver platter." I laughed. It was a cold, sharp sound that sliced cleanly through the heavy, suffocating silence of the banquet hall. "I am afraid you are severely mistaken, Julian," I replied, taking a slow, predatory step around him. "I did not sign over Genesis Biomedical. I signed over Apex Billing Solutions. It was the parent company listed on the mediation paperwork you were too arrogant to actually read. You were so blinded by your own greed, so eager to destroy me, that you assumed Apex owned Genesis. You bullied the mediator to rush the proceedings. You threatened to ruin me publicly if I did not sign the transfer documents immediately." I raised the remote and clicked it one final time. A stark, highly classified federal document appeared on the screens. It bore the unmistakable, terrifying seal of the Internal Revenue Service. "Apex Billing Solutions is a defunct, completely empty shell subsidiary I acquired 3 years ago," I explained, relishing the utter total destruction forming in his eyes. "It holds absolutely zero intellectual property. It has no client list. It possesses no proprietary software. What it does possess, however, is a massive, highly toxic liability. Apex Billing is currently under a multi-agency federal IRS audit for historical tax evasion dating back to long before I purchased it." Julian stopped breathing. His hands dropped to his sides. The manic, greedy gleam in his eyes extinguished instantly, replaced by a hollow, bottomless terror. His knees physically buckled, forcing him to catch himself on the back of a silk-draped chair. "By aggressively forcing me to sign over that specific corporate entity during our binding mediation today," I continued, my voice dropping to a dangerous, lethal pitch that carried to the very back of the room, "you did not steal my wealth, Julian. You legally and permanently bound yourself to a $5 million federal tax debt. You literally begged the judge to make you solely responsible for defrauding the IRS. I even asked you 3 times on the official record if you were absolutely certain you wanted full ownership of that specific LLC. You arrogantly said yes." "That is illegal," Julian gasped, stumbling backward until he hit the edge of a catering table. Expensive silver chafing dishes clattered loudly to the floor. You tricked me. You set me up. That contract is void. You extorted me, I corrected sharply, my gaze pinning him to the spot. You used your illegal connections with a corrupt family court judge to force a rushed mediation threatening to drag my business through a fabricated public scandal if I did not surrender my assets to you. I simply gave you exactly what you legally forcefully demanded. You own it all, Julian. Every single penny of that $5 million debt is now tied directly to your social security number. Julian looked frantically around the room, searching for a lifeline. He looked at Kendra, who was still pinned against the far wall by Tasha's smartphone camera, her face stained with mascara and tears. He looked at Silas, who was completely catatonic, realizing his golden son-in-law had destroyed his church. He looked at the mayor, the man he needed to endorse his political run. The mayor actively turned his back in disgust and began walking briskly toward the exit, signaling his aides to follow. The entire political machine that Julian had spent years greasing was abandoning him in real time. He was radioactive. He had no money. His secret offshore accounts had been emptied by Darren. His law firm was evicted and locked down. He was $5 million in debt to the federal government. And he had just been exposed for embezzling $3 million from a megachurch on a live stream broadcast to thousands of people. He was completely, utterly annihilated. The two plainclothes federal agents who had been standing silently at the base of the stairs finally made their move. They stepped forward in perfect, intimidating unison, their heavy leather shoes silent on the marble floor. The taller agent reached into the breast pocket of his tailored suit jacket and produced a gold badge, holding it up high, so the entire front row of terrified socialites could clearly see it. Julian Vance. The agent stated, his voice a low, authoritative rumble that cut through the remaining frantic murmurs in the room like a physical blade. He reached to his belt and unclipped a pair of heavy steel handcuffs, the metallic sound ringing out with absolute finality. You are under arrest for wire fraud, embezzlement, and judicial bribery. The cold, sharp click of the heavy steel handcuffs resonated like a gavel striking a sound block. The taller federal agent spun Julian around, pressing him roughly against the edge of a silk-draped table to secure the restraints. Silverware clattered sharply to the marble floor as the agent loudly recited the Miranda rights. Julian's pristine $5,000 tuxedo jacket bunched awkwardly around his neck. His legs entirely gave out from beneath him, forcing the agents to physically hoist him upright by his armpits. The local news crews, originally confined to the sidewalk outside to capture glamorous red carpet arrivals, had smelled blood in the water. They breached the sanctuary doors, their heavy cameras mounted on their shoulders, bright LED spotlights washing over Julian's tear-streaked, devastated face. He squeezed his eyes tightly shut, turning his head away to hide from the glaring lenses, but there was absolutely no escape. The golden boy of the city's political elite, the untouchable legal shark, was being dragged out in chains for the entire world to witness. Panic rippled violently through Kendra. She watched her husband being hauled away like a common thief, the terrifying reality of federal prison suddenly crashing down upon her carefully constructed reality. She spun around her silver-sequined gown, catching the harsh camera lights, and launched herself at Darren. She grabbed the lapels of his suit, her perfectly manicured nails digging frantically into the fabric. She begged him, her voice cracking with raw, unhinged hysteria, pleading with him to stop this, to protect the mother of his children, to tell the federal agents it was all a massive misunderstanding. Darren did not flinch. His expression remained a mask of absolute, impenetrable ice. He reached up, detached her desperate fingers from his jacket with clinical precision, and let her hands drop. He turned his back on her and walked away without saying a single word. As Darren moved out of the frame, the second plainclothes agent stepped seamlessly into his place. He flashed his gold badge directly in Kendra's face, loudly declaring her under arrest for her role in the wire fraud and the real estate money laundering. Kendra let out a guttural, breathless shriek, thrashing wildly, causing her high heels to slip on the marble as the agent forcefully secured her wrists in steel. The absolute destruction of the Vance dynasty was complete, unfolding in a matter of minutes. My mother, Deidre, realized the empire she had built was entirely reduced to ash. Stripped of all her haughty arrogance, her elite social standing evaporating before her eyes, she stumbled forward. Her emerald green gown dragged heavily on the floor. She looked at her husband, Reverend Silas, who was currently slumped over his own pulpit, weeping openly into his hands as the congregation he had defrauded hurled insults and demanded their money back. Deidre rushed the stage, her hands shaking uncontrollably, her face a mask of pure, unfiltered desperation. She lunged toward me, reaching out to physically grab my hands. I stepped back smoothly, denying her the contact she had actively denied me for decades. She fell to her knees at the base of the altar, sobbing with a ferocity that ruined her flawless makeup. "Please, Camille." Deidre choked out, the sound amplified by the chaotic acoustics of the ruined hall. "We are family. You can fix this. Pay the money back. Do not let them take your father's church." I looked down at the woman who had spent my entire life making me feel infinitely small. I looked at the woman who had called me an embarrassment, a dropout, a pathetic failure who dragged down her pristine high society image. I felt absolutely no anger. The blinding rage that had fueled me for years was completely gone, replaced by a chilling, absolute calm. I tilted my head, my voice carrying no malice, only the cold, hard weight of reality. "You told me failures do not belong in this family, Mom." I stated, my words slicing cleanly through her desperate sobs. "You were right. Enjoy the fallout." I turned away from the pulpit. I did not look back at my father weeping on the stage. I did not look back at my mother kneeling broken on the floor. I walked down the center aisle of the cathedral. The chaotic, screaming sea of wealthy donors, politicians, and socialites instantly fell silent as I approached. They parted from me with a profound, undeniable reverence mixed with absolute fear. No one dared to speak. No one dared to make eye contact or offer an empty pleasantry. They pressed themselves tightly against the wooden pews, giving me a wide, unobstructed path. The crimson silk of my gown swept across the marble, trailing behind me like liquid fire, the only sound in my immediate vicinity being the sharp, rhythmic click of my heels. I reached the back of the banquet hall, stepped out into the cool winter night, and let the heavy oak doors swing shut behind me, completely sealing the chaos inside. The freezing, suffocating winter of that city faded into a distant, irrelevant memory. The scene shifted entirely to the blindingly bright, sun-drenched morning of Christmas Day. The air was thick with the scent of sea salt and blooming hibiscus. I was sitting on the expansive teakwood balcony of a 5-star luxury private villa in the Maldives. The crystal-clear turquoise waters of the Indian Ocean stretched out infinitely before me, shimmering like crushed diamonds under the equatorial sun. Aaliyah sat cross-legged on the plush white daybed beside me. The warm ocean breeze caught her dark curls as she tore excitedly through premium wrapping paper. Around her neck rested the delicate silver chain holding the tiny, exquisite snow globe pendant. She held up a new, brightly colored marine biology book, her face splitting into a brilliant, unburdened laugh that echoed joyously across the private deck. There was no fear in her eyes. There was no shadow of Julian's manipulation hanging over her childhood. She was completely safe, entirely loved, and utterly free. I leaned back against the cushioned wicker chair, raising a porcelain cup of freshly brewed espresso to my lips. I took a slow, deliberate sip, letting the rich warmth settle deeply into my chest. I looked out at the endless, peaceful expanse of the ocean. There were no court dates looming. There were no corporate battles left to fight. The staggering weight of my past had been surgically excised and destroyed by their own toxic greed. The storm was completely over, and the crown was exactly where it belonged.